Imagine just for a moment that the story you were taught was only half of what really happened. Imagine that a single hidden thread pulled tight across 2,000 years could unravel everything we think we know about faith power and the men who shaped the world. What if the most guarded secret in Western history wasn't a relic or a revelation, but a family line? And what if that line began with Jesus and ended with the Knights Templar? The idea sounds impossible. It sounds outrageous. But the deeper you look, the harder it's on. So breathe for a moment. Let the pulse slow and slip with me into a quieter rhythm. We're leaving the shock behind, now moving into the soft territory, where questions become invitations and history starts whispering. You've stepped into a story that has been hiding in plain sight for centuries, tucked between the margins of scripture rumors and the uneasy silences that institutions tend to keep. As you settle in, imagine the dust of old libraries rising around you, imagine candlelight flickering over parchment, and imagine the faint sense that something unsaid has always been waiting at the edge of memory. The idea of a hidden bloodline isn't new, yet its persistence tells you there is something beneath the surface, something historians debate with raised eyebrows, something theologians avoid with careful politeness, and something secret societies have woven into symbols that most people won't. You are about to follow that thread from the ancient streets of Judea all the way to the battle-scarred world of the Templars, tracing a path that has survived exile crusades, political purges, and more than a few suspicious clerical edits. And yes, we will go slowly, calmly, even playfully, because a mystery this heavy needs the occasional soft grin. Think of it as a bedtime conspiracy, one that keeps you relaxed while the past does. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Then let your shoulders loosen, let the room fall quiet, and allow the possibility of an unbroken bloodline to settle beside you. Whether you believe it now doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here at the threshold of a story that has been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. You move forward from that threshold you crossed earlier, still carrying the echo of that first unsettling idea that a story can be both familiar and incomplete at the same time. The earliest hints of a hidden lineage don't appear as thunderous revelations, but as soft disturbances in the historical record, like uneven stitching in an old tapestry. You notice them only when you slow your gaze, the same way you noticed the silent gaps in the story you were taught. And as you lean in, those gaps widen into paths. One of the few solid anchors you can touch is a simple fact: by the 1st century, Jewish families kept careful genealogical records, preserving lines of descent with near ritual precision. This was not a world where heritage floated unanchored. Identity was lineage. Lineage was legitimacy. Kings, priests, and common households alike traced their roots with a seriousness that makes modern family trees look like light hobbies. Knowing this, you begin to wonder how a movement as significant as early Christianity could emerge without some mention of continuity, inheritance, or family lines beyond the obvious divine metaphor. If ancestry mattered so deeply in that world, why does the record around Jesus become so abruptly silent that silence is loud enough to draw attention? And it has for centuries. You encounter an obscure early tradition whispered through fringe communities in Egypt and Syria, suggesting that followers of Jesus preserved private teachings that emphasized his human ties more than his divine ones. Most mainstream scholars approach these claims with a raised eyebrow and a polite cough, but they persist in corners of old manuscripts hinting that the earliest generations may have understood something that later authorities preferred to smooth away. One particularly controversial interpretation proposes that Jesus, as a Jewish teacher with followers, would almost certainly have been expected to marry. To remain unmarried in that culture was rare, unusual, and even socially suspect. Whether that interpretation holds weight or not, you can feel how it presses against the silence, asking whether absence is the same as impossibility. And yet this is where the debate fractures into mystery. If there was a family line, why does it fade? Why is there no neat list of descendants, no winding family scroll tucked safely into a monastery vault? Some believe the turmoil after the crucifixion forced an intentional disappearance, a deliberate choice to protect surviving relatives from political retaliation. Rome did not have a gentle reputation, with movements perceived as threats. It wasn't exactly known for sending handwritten apology notes. The idea that a vulnerable family might vanish for survival is not so far-fetched when viewed through that lens. Still, history never moves without leaving fingerprints somewhere. You start noticing faint ones scattered across time. A second-century writer hints at teachings given privately to those close to him, phrasing that has fueled centuries of speculation. Another text, long rejected by official canon, briefly mentions companions who traveled with Jesus in a way that blurs the line between spiritual and familial relationship. None of these references are definitive. Each could be interpreted more than one way. But combined, they create a pattern faint enough to deny, yet stubborn enough to resist erasure. As you sift through these fragments, you find yourself returning to the feeling that opened this journey, that quiet suspicion that a story has been trimmed at the edges. You catch yourself wondering if the silence was intentional, whether by persecution, politics, or theological reshaping. After all, beliefs don't remain pure across centuries. They are curated, edited, and streamlined sometimes by faithful hands, hoping to protect a message sometimes, by powerful hands, hoping to protect authority. In the middle of that delicate push and pull, what story might have been considered too explosive to survive untouched? A light joke crosses your mind. If ancient writers had used social media, at least you'd have a few cryptic subtweets to help out. But they didn't. So you make do with interpretive archaeology instead, brushing gently across textual fragments like someone cleaning dust off old pottery. You know better than to force conclusions, but you also know that mysteries often begin inside small irregularities. As you wander deeper into these early whispers, you also notice how fiercely later institutions insisted on uniformity. With time, the idea of Jesus having descendants became not just unlikely, but unthinkable within official doctrine. That intensity alone raises its own question: why respond so strongly to something harmless unless it threatened something not so harmless? You don't need to answer yet. You simply let the question sit beside you the way you let the possibility of a lineage settle earlier in the introduction. A second quiet joke surfaces as you imagine early church councils debating which stories to keep, which to fold away, and which to launch into the theological equivalent of witness protection. You picture one scribe sighing dramatically as he scratches out a line while another mutters about narrative cohesion. Even whispered humor softens the weight of the unknown, letting the mystery feel like a companion rather than a burden. But humor aside, you know that early erasure, if it happened, would not be unusual. Rome erased dynasties. Emperors erased rivals. Religious movements erased competing doctrines. Sometimes what survives is not what was truest, but what was safest. And that brings you to the open question scholars continue to wrestle with today. Were these early hints simply the byproduct of imaginative communities exploring symbolic interpretations, or were they the final traces of something real that slowly slipped beneath the surface? No consensus exists. The debate continues, shaped as much by personal worldview as by available evidence. What you do know is that the first clues, faint as they are, form the foundation of a far larger mystery, one that will eventually stretch across continents, manuscripts, and centuries until it reaches the armored hands of the Templars. But for now, you stay in this quieter moment, recognizing that every great investigation begins not with certainty, but with the courage to let the unanswered linger. You move now into one of the most delicate threads in this entire investigation, a thread woven so tightly into myth, rumor, art, and theological debate that simply touching it feels like brushing dust from a locked reliquary. Mary Magdalene has been called many things across history: witness, disciple, sinner, saint, patron, companion. But beneath those shifting titles lies a quieter question, one that scholars tiptoe around as carefully as curators handling a fragile scroll. If any bloodline story could have taken root, why does her name appear again and again at its center, glowing faintly like a watermark that refuses to fade? You start with what can actually be verified, because in mysteries, this tangled a single stable fact is a welcome anchor. Historically, Mary Magdalene is recorded as one of the few individuals present both at the crucifixion and the discovery of the empty tomb. That positioning alone marks her as unusually significant within early Christian circles, since major events rarely list female witnesses so prominently. Her presence at these pivotal moments suggests she held a role deeper than an occasional follower, drifting at the edge of the story. There is a reason her name survived when so many others did not, and even that small certainty begins to cast longer shadows. As you linger on that fact, you begin to notice the obscurities. Several early texts, especially those excluded from the later canon, portray her in a far more central and authoritative way. One manuscript depicts her as the recipient of teachings not shared with others, described as a companion in language that has ignited centuries of speculation. Another shows tension between her and male disciples, hinting at rivalry fueled not merely by spiritual disagreements, but by perceived proximity to Jesus himself. Those passages don't scream scandal. They whisper it, which somehow makes them more intriguing. It's the historical equivalent of finding a note written in polite handwriting, but pressed so hard into the page that you can feel the emotion behind it. You pause for a moment, amused at how this gentle investigation now feels suspiciously like ancient relationship drama. Scholars often deliver these debates in solemn tones, but you can't help imagining a first-century disciple muttering, "Why does she always get the important conversations?" Even a little humor helps soften the fact that these texts, obscure though they are, open the door to interpretations that make some institutions shift uncomfortably in their seats. Still, obscurity alone does not confirm lineage. It simply builds atmosphere. The real tension lies in the persistent claim, never proven, never fully dismissed, that Mary Magdalene may have been more than a disciple. Certain traditions from southern France, whispered through medieval folklore, describe a woman arriving from Judea with companions carrying not just stories, but responsibility. These tales, recorded centuries after the events they describe, speak of a family forced into exile, fleeing turmoil and political danger. Skeptics argue that these legends reflect medieval fascination rather than historical memory. Yet the geographic consistency of these stories, clustered tightly around the same coastal regions, makes them difficult to ignore entirely. As you evaluate these whispers, you find yourself circling back to what you uncovered earlier, the silence around Jesus' familial ties. Silence is rarely random in historical narratives. It tends to form in places where clarity would complicate things. If early followers believed Mary Magdalene carried a legacy, literal, spiritual, or both, one can imagine why later editors of doctrine, faced with growing movements and competing interpretations, might choose a safer, narrower portrayal of her identity. A simple sinner turned saint is easier to manage than a potential matriarch of a sacred line. At this point, you sense another open question taking shape, one that continues to stir debate in academic circles. Were these later depictions of Mary Magdalene intentionally softened to counteract earlier traditions that granted her greater authority? Some scholars argue yes, pointing to the noticeable decline of her prominence in later texts. Others insist that the diversity of portrayals simply reflects evolving community needs. But no matter the interpretation, the contrast remains striking, and contrasts tend to reveal more than they hide. You gently acknowledge the possibility that these obscure details might be no more than symbolic narratives intended to convey spiritual truths. But symbolism, like secrecy, often grows from seeds buried in real events. The fact that Mary Magdalene appears repeatedly at the fault lines where theology meets politics suggests she held a position that mattered perhaps more than later institutions preferred to acknowledge. A small joke breaks through your concentration as you imagine Mary herself listening to all of this from some celestial vantage point, perhaps amused, perhaps exhausted, perhaps rolling her eyes at 2 millennia of commentary. Yet even that softened moment reminds you of something essential. The persistence of her presence across history is itself an anomaly. Figures fade when they leave no deeper impression. She has not faded, and so you let the unanswered linger once more. If the earliest whispers of a bloodline exist, her shadow rests at the very beginning of the trail. Whether as symbolic guardian, misunderstood figure, or literal ancestor, Mary Magdalene remains the most plausible focal point through which any lineage would have flowed. The real challenge lies not in proving her role, but in understanding why her story changed and who may have shaped that change. You drift deeper into the labyrinth, now guided by the faint outlines of writings that were once considered sacred by someone somewhere before they were quietly set aside. These texts, often called apocryphal or extra-canonical, linger at the edges of official history like half-forgotten melodies. They are not the foundation of doctrine, yet they refuse to vanish, resurfacing every few generations with new eyes and new questions. And as you move through them, you begin noticing how many of these writings circle around the same figures you've already met on this journey, especially the one whose presence has followed you from earlier moments, Mary Magdalene. You start with what scholars can agree on because a stable fact always provides a place to stand. Several early Christian communities produced Gospels that never made it into the canonical list finalized centuries later. These include the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary, among others. They were written in the same ancient world, in the same swirl of early belief. And yet they present glimpses of relationships, teachings, and dynamics that differ from the familiar narrative. Their exclusion was not an accident. It was a deliberate process shaped by councils, politics, and theological priorities. As you let your attention settle on the Gospel of Philip, a detail rises from the page like a soft breath. In one surviving line, Mary Magdalene is described as someone whom Jesus loved more than the other disciples, a phrase that has fueled centuries of commentary, conspiracy, and quiet eyebrow-raising. The manuscript is fragmented, the wording debated, the meaning uncertain, but even its mere existence complicates the neat, polished image handed down through later tradition. When a text suggests personal closeness, scholars debate whether the language is symbolic, metaphorical, or literal, but the question itself becomes a thread worth tugging. That leads you to a more obscure detail embedded in another manuscript. In the Gospel of Mary, the disciples are shown turning to her for guidance after the crucifixion, seeking clarity from teachings she alone received. One disciple expresses irritation that Jesus chose her as the recipient of deeper wisdom. Whether this indicates hierarchy rivalry or simple narrative flourish remains uncertain, but it adds another layer to the portrait you began forming earlier. These texts do not portray her as a marginal figure. They place her near the center, where influence and intimacy intersect. You can't help but notice how these echoes dovetail with what you previously uncovered: the unusual prominence of Mary Magdalene in key moments, and the recurring suggestion that she held knowledge others did not. It is as if the suppressed Gospels form an undercurrent gently pushing back against the simplified versions created in later centuries. You imagine them whispering from the shelves of forgotten monasteries, saying the story was once wider than you were allowed to see. A subtle laugh escapes you at the thought of ancient scribes arguing over which manuscript should make the cut, like celestial editors debating narrative flow. You picture one monk insisting this one adds unnecessary complexity, while another mutters complexity is the entire point. These imagined bickering sessions at least make the process feel human, reminding you that the formation of the biblical canon was not a mystical event, but a very human act of selection. Of course, the real scholarly debate emerges from the moment you ask why certain texts were excluded. Some argue that the apocryphal writings were set aside because they appeared too late, written decades after eyewitness accounts would have been possible. Others counter that several canonical Gospels were themselves composed long after the events they describe. Then there is the argument that certain passages, especially those emphasizing Mary Magdalene's authority or portraying Jesus in more human terms, were removed because they threatened emerging structures of power. Institutions prefer clarity, hierarchy, and predictability. A narrative that hints at intimate family ties or alternate teachings might introduce questions too difficult to manage. Another open question that continues to stir debate: did any of these suppressed writings once contain genealogical details, references to descendants, or hints of family continuity? The surviving fragments don't offer definitive proof, but some scholars note that gaps in manuscripts often correspond to places where editors later applied heavy revision. The absence itself becomes suspicious, like a page torn from a journal at the exact moment the story becomes interesting. You may never know what those missing lines once held, but the lingering possibility keeps the mind alert. As you explore these texts, you find yourself returning again to that persistent silence around the familial life of Jesus. If the early communities were as diverse as these Gospels suggest, then it becomes easier to imagine that some groups preserved traditions that others preferred to forget. A hidden lineage, if it existed, would not need to be shouted. It would need only a handful of guardians and the discipline to keep quiet. And when you consider how many early Christian factions disappeared, splintered, or absorbed into dominant traditions, the idea that certain stories might have vanished with them becomes entirely plausible. Another gentle joke passes through your thoughts as you imagine discovering some ancient scroll with the neat heading, "Family Records Do Not Lose." History rarely grants such convenience. Instead, it offers contradictions, gaps, and mysteries that require patience rather than certainty. But in the swirling ambiguity of these texts, you feel something taking shape, not a conclusion, but a direction. These suppressed Gospels do not prove a bloodline, but they crack open the narrative just wide enough to let the question breathe. They present a world in which relationships were more complex, communities more diverse, and spiritual authority more distributed than later stories admit. And as you move forward, you carry with you the sense that the official version of events may represent only one voice in a much larger conversation. The real mystery now becomes not why these texts existed, but why they faded, and what those silences might still be hiding. You ease into the next part of this investigation with the soft awareness that stories often migrate farther than people do. What begins as a rumor in one century can settle as folklore in another, and sometimes those folk tales preserve details that history books overlook. The theory that Jesus' family, or at least those closest to him, escaped to Gaul after the turmoil in Judea is one of those narratives that seems too dramatic to be true, yet somehow too persistent to dismiss. And as you drift through its many layers, you notice the way earlier threads tug at this one, shaping its contours with quiet familiarity. You begin by grounding yourself in a historical fact that provides the first foothold during the 1st century. The Roman Empire maintained active sea routes between the eastern Mediterranean and the coastline of what is now southern France. Traders, soldiers, administrators, and refugees moved along these routes with surprising regularity. Travel was not rare. Travel was infrastructure. That alone makes the idea of political exiles fleeing Judea by sea far more plausible than people often imagine. You don't need a miracle to get someone from Jerusalem to Gaul, just a ship, a sympathetic crew, and perhaps a few coins slipped discreetly into the right hands. From that anchor point, you drift into the more obscure territory of medieval tradition. In several coastal towns of southern France, legends speak of a group arriving from the east around the 1st century. The details vary as folklore tends to do, but the common thread is unmistakable. A woman named Mary, accompanied by companions, sometimes described as bearing a heavy sorrow, sometimes described as carrying something more precious than grief. These stories formed the foundation of local devotion long before they ever became fodder for modern theories. Pilgrims traveled to these regions for centuries, drawn by whispers of an Eastern origin story deeper than the local church preferred to emphasize. One detail in particular often sparks curiosity: the way these French traditions consistently reference a woman of high status. Someone protected someone whose presence required secrecy. The language used in these legends feels cautious, as if the storytellers knew they were speaking around something rather than about it. You hear echoes of earlier mysteries, the unusual prominence of Mary Magdalene, the silence surrounding possible family ties, and the way suppressed texts seem to orbit the same constellation of themes. None of this forms proof, but the alignment is difficult to ignore. A soft smile touches your thoughts as you imagine a medieval monk hearing these stories from local fishermen and quietly deciding, "This is above my pay grade," before writing down only half of what he learned. It's comforting in an odd way to remember that history isn't built solely from official records. It's shaped by ordinary people telling stories beside fires on docks or in the corner of a market stall. If those people believed something extraordinary happened, their voices linger even when institutions prefer silence. The debate among modern scholars becomes particularly lively whenever this theory surfaces. Some argue that the French traditions are later inventions woven during the Middle Ages to attract pilgrims or enhance local prestige. Others counter that the remarkable consistency of these stories across isolated regions suggests deeper roots. After all, independent communities rarely invent matching narratives unless they stem from a shared memory, even if that memory has been weathered by centuries of retelling. The open question remains unresolved. Are these tales reflections of symbolic faith, or do they preserve faint traces of real events blurred by time? As you weigh the possibilities, you return to the political climate of the 1st century. After the crucifixion, followers of Jesus faced hostility from both Roman authorities and certain local factions. Families of executed leaders were often targeted as potential rallying points for rebellion. In that environment, disappearing was not an act of abandonment. It was a strategy for survival. You imagine a group slipping into anonymity, boarding a vessel at night, choosing exile over extinction. The thought carries a quiet gravity softened only by an unexpected moment of humor as you picture one of them realizing halfway across the sea that they forgot to pack enough bread. Ancient travel, after all, was rarely elegant. The most controversial interpretation of the Gaul narrative proposes that this group did not merely seek refuge, but carried forward a lineage that needed protection. Proponents of this theory suggest that Judea was too dangerous, too unstable, too politically watched for such a family to survive openly. Gaul, by contrast, offered distance, obscurity, and communities more willing to adopt outsiders. Whether that lineage involved Mary Magdalene herself or someone connected to her remains the subject of heated debate. But even skeptics admit that southern France became a center of early Christian presence unusually early, raising questions about how the message traveled so far so fast. You notice how this theory echoes a tension you've encountered before: the contrast between the official narrative's tight boundaries and the broader, more complex stories that linger along its edges. If the earliest Christian movement was more diverse than tradition suggests, then alternative migration paths, hidden communities, and suppressed memories become not only possible, but likely. The idea of a family escaping persecution aligns with patterns observed throughout Roman history, where threatened groups often fled to distant provinces. Still, the open question persists: if such a journey happened, why did the details blur into legend instead of remaining clear historical record? Some scholars argue that secrecy was intentional, perhaps, to protect individuals from political or religious authorities. Others believe the memory simply dissolved into myth as generations passed. But when you look at the coastal shrines, the medieval carvings depicting Eastern travelers, and the liturgies dedicated to a mysterious arrival, you can't help feeling that something, whether symbolic or literal, left a deep imprint. Once again, you let humor soften the weight of speculation as you imagine a Roman customs officer trying to decide whether to stamp the travel documents of a group who might be carrying the future of Western civilization. Bureaucracy probably won in the end, as it often does. Yet beneath the jokes lies a more serious recognition legends form around meaningful events, not trivial ones. The endurance of these stories indicates a past that mattered, even if the details have grown soft around the edges. And as you lean closer to the whispering coastline of Gaul, you begin to sense the first threads of a lineage weaving outward, stretching toward the centuries when armored warriors would rise in the Holy Land, bearing symbols that hint at secrets older than their order. Whatever truth lies within the Gaul tradition, it moves you forward along a path shaped not only by what was recorded, but also by what was concealed. You move now into a chapter of the investigation, where legend and monarchy mingle so closely that it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The Merovingians, the ruling dynasty of early medieval Frankish kingdoms, have long been wrapped in an aura of mystique that makes them feel less like historical rulers and more like characters from an illuminated manuscript. Their long hair, their semi-sacred status, their strange rise to power, all of it has invited whispers that something older, deeper, and perhaps bloodbound flowed beneath their throne. And as you step into this part of the story, you begin to sense how threads from earlier moments, the flight to Gaul, the persistent traditions around mysterious Eastern arrivals, start converging with unexpected precision. You begin with what is historically undeniable, because a firm fact is always the surest first step. The Merovingians did rule large portions of what is now France and Germany beginning in the 5th century. They were real kings documented in chronicles, laws, and treaties. Their dynasty produced leaders like Clovis, a figure so influential that even modern French history books treat him with a mixture of reverence and weary familiarity. The Merovingians were known for their fierce independence, their reliance on local power structures, and their distinctive appearance, most notably the royal custom of never cutting their hair, which contemporaries believed symbolized divine authority. That feature alone sets them apart, marking them as rulers who claimed legitimacy rooted in something other than brute force or administrative skill. As you drift deeper into the dynasty's mythic shadow, you encounter one of the more obscure details that has fascinated scholars and storytellers alike. Some medieval texts describe the Merovingian line as originating from a union between a Frankish queen and a mysterious sea creature, an obviously symbolic narrative, yet one that hints at an ancestral origin considered unusual or extraordinary. Scholars debate whether the tale reflects older pagan traditions, political propaganda, or attempts to portray the dynasty as semi-divine. But hidden within that strangeness lies an open question: why did their legitimacy require a story of supernatural heritage, unless the truth of their beginnings was already complicated or contested? This leads you naturally toward the theory, controversial, debated, and never fully proven, that the Merovingians might have been shaped or influenced by families who traced their roots back to the eastern Mediterranean. Some versions propose that exiles from Judea possibly connected to early followers of Jesus settled in southern Gaul centuries before the Merovingians emerged. Over generations, their lineage may have intertwined with local nobility, eventually culminating in a dynasty whose legitimacy rested on bloodlines rather than conquest. Skeptics raise eyebrows at this idea, yet it aligns intriguingly with what you explored earlier: the persistent traditions in Gaul, the stories of Eastern arrivals, and the quiet geographic overlap between those legends and the early Merovingian sphere. A light moment of humor drifts through your thoughts as you imagine a medieval scribe trying to explain a royal genealogy to confused villagers, perhaps saying, "Oh, don't worry about the sea monster bit. The important thing is that they're legitimate." Even kings, it seems, found creative ways to manage public relations. But creativity alone does not erase the questions. One of the strongest arguments fueling the Merovingian bloodline theory comes from the way medieval chroniclers described their kings. They often emphasized a sacred aura surrounding the dynasty, portraying them as rulers with divine favor so intrinsic that even dethroned Merovingians were kept alive by rival dynasties out of fear that killing them would disrupt cosmic order. This unusual reverence suggests that their lineage carried symbolic or spiritual significance far beyond normal aristocratic heritage. You find yourself circling back to something you noticed earlier: hidden stories survive best when wrapped in symbolism. If a royal family did carry an ancestry considered too sensitive to state plainly, whether for political, religious, or cultural reasons, it might have been expressed through allegory rather than direct declaration. Hair as a symbol of divine legitimacy, mythical ancestry, unusual emphasis on birthright. These motifs feel less like random medieval quirks and more like protective veils covering a deeper origin story. An open debate continues among historians about whether the Merovingians maintained connections to communities with Eastern Christian roots. Some argue that trade routes and migration patterns make such links entirely plausible. Others insist the evidence is too circumstantial to form conclusions. But even skeptics admit the peculiar coincidence that the regions associated with Mary Magdalene's arrival, the same ones you explored in the previous chapter, sit squarely within early Merovingian territory. Coincidence does not prove causation, but it does encourage curiosity. As you let these possibilities unfold, another gentle laugh sneaks in as you imagine the Merovingian court attempting to keep any unusual ancestry quiet while maintaining royal gravitas. You picture a king sighing deeply as advisors whisper, "Maybe don't mention the sea creature origin at tonight's banquet." Even ancient rulers had branding challenges. Yet beneath the levity lies a more serious recognition. The Merovingians are one of the few European dynasties described with an intensity usually reserved for sacred lineages. Their fall, too, feels suspiciously abrupt. After centuries of rule, they were displaced by the Carolingians, who made a point of portraying the Merovingians as weak, decadent, and unsuitable for leadership. Some modern interpretations suggest this campaign of defamation might have concealed political motives, perhaps aimed at severing public affection for a dynasty whose ancestry carried inconvenient implications. The real open question, the one scholars continue to tug at, is whether the Merovingian sense of sacred legitimacy originated from actual ancestral claims or merely from political theater. No definitive evidence places them directly within a bloodline connected to Jesus. Yet the convergence of legends, geographic proximity, cultural symbolism, and abrupt political shifts creates a pattern that feels too intentional to ignore. You step back gently, letting all these threads settle into a single, steady awareness. The Merovingians may not reveal the bloodline outright, but they form a crucial bridge between ancient whispers and medieval power structures. Their story becomes a hinge in the narrative, one that turns your attention toward the centuries that follow, when secrets once carried in exile would rise again in the hands of a new and formidable order. For now, you let the dynasty fade into the candle-lit halls of its own history, knowing their shadow will return in the investigations ahead. You ease into a quieter corridor of the investigation, now one-lined not with illuminated manuscripts or royal legends, but with the more subtle architecture of omission, those places in history where silence is so deliberate it begins to sound like a language of its own. By this point in your journey, you've noticed how certain threads keep reappearing: rumors of an Eastern family in Gaul, the unusual aura surrounding the Merovingians, and the recurring presence of Mary Magdalene in suppressed writings. Now you turn toward the institution that eventually shaped the official story, the Church, and observe the way its careful curation of history, theology, and narrative leaves shadows where more curious eyes expect detail. You start with the truth that everyone agrees on as Christianity grew from scattered communities into an organized structure. It needed clarity. It needed consistency. And so, beginning in the 4th century, bishops, theologians, and councils worked to create a unified narrative of origins, teachings, and lineage. This was the formative moment when the canon was set, doctrines were codified, and the sprawling diversity of early beliefs was slowly narrowed into a more singular path. That is the historical fact, an attempt to establish unity. Yet unity always requires decision-making, and decision-making requires choosing what belongs and what must be gently ushered into the realm of the unofficial. Within that gentle ushering, you find the first hints of something intriguing. Several medieval writers, clerics, monks, chroniclers make passing references to traditions or stories known among laypeople but discouraged in formal teaching. They rarely elaborate. Instead, they gesture vaguely toward ideas considered too speculative, too disruptive, or too politically inconvenient to preserve. One obscure commentator from the 12th century even remarks that certain tales of the Magdalene are best left unspoken, a line that would be harmless if not for how precisely it echoes themes you've already encountered. As you reflect on this, you can't help smiling at the mental image of a medieval scribe closing a book with a dramatic sigh and thinking, well, that's going to stir trouble, before quietly shifting the manuscript into a locked cupboard. Even monks, it seems, had the occasional flair for dramatic secrecy. But secrecy often indicates tension. One of the key questions scholars continue to debate is why stories involving Mary Magdalene, her authority, or her potential family ties were so consistently minimized in official doctrine while flourishing vividly in regional traditions. If these stories were merely fanciful, why suppress them so systematically? And if they carried even a sliver of genuine historical memory, why allow them to survive in the margins rather than openly condemn or fully integrate them? That unresolved tension becomes a doorway into the deeper mystery. The Church's silence also becomes more noticeable when placed beside the spread of certain medieval rumors that suggested early leaders had access to genealogical knowledge too sensitive to record. Some of these whispers appear in monastic chronicles, couched in caution and irony. A monk in Burgundy writes vaguely of a lineage too holy for parchment, while another writing a century later mentions writings best guarded from the careless. Neither describes the contents outright. Neither needs to. Their reluctance suggests the belief that certain ideas, even if not officially endorsed, circulated widely enough to require subtle management rather than open confrontation. This is where an obscure detail emerges quiet yet telling. In several medieval dioceses across the south of France, the same regions associated with early legends of Mary Magdalene's arrival, church officials issued unusually strict prohibitions against lay storytelling that confuses the sacred with the familial. The phrasing is peculiar, almost as if designed to silence a rumor without naming it. Many historians interpret this as a reference to narratives suggesting Jesus had descendants. Others disagree, arguing the language was metaphorical. But the ambiguity itself reinforces the patterns you've been following, where one would expect the Church to clarify it, instead gestures obliquely, almost nervously, toward ideas floating beneath the surface. A small laugh passes through your thoughts as you imagine medieval priests guilt-tripping people out of gossip with the ancient equivalent of, "Please stop spreading," that we're trying to run a religion here. Even institutions with vast authority had to deal with persistent public imagination, especially when that imagination tapped into stories that felt older than the official narrative. The open debate you encounter here centers on whether the Church actively suppressed lineage-related narratives or simply ignored them. Scholars cannot agree. Some argue that suppression was strategic, protecting theological claims about divinity from the complications of human ancestry. Others believe the Church never considered such stories credible enough to merit strong action. Both positions have merit. Yet when you place these arguments beside the consistent patterns of silence, the sudden shifts in portrayal and the geographic clustering of forbidden tales, you sense a deeper coherence. You also notice how these medieval rumors intersect subtly with what you learned about the Merovingians. Chroniclers writing after the fall of that dynasty occasionally hinted that rival powers feared certain ancestral claims tied to the old line. The Church closely allied with those rising powers would have had every incentive to discourage any narrative that restored prestige to the deposed family, especially a narrative involving sacred origins. As these threads weave together, another gentle moment of humor helps lighten the density of the inquiry. You imagine a medieval council debating how to categorize a particularly troublesome rumor only for one weary cleric to propose, "Could we simply pretend it doesn't exist?" A strategy used by parents, institutions, and ancient empires alike. But beyond the humor lies the recognition that silence can be more revealing than speech. When an institution records battles, councils, heresies, miracles, and martyrs with meticulous detail, yet leaves certain questions untouched, you begin to wonder whether those absences were intentional protections rather than accidental gaps. The open question that remains a question scholars still approach gingerly is whether medieval authorities guarded against the spread of stories involving a sacred lineage because they feared theological confusion, political unrest, or the possibility that such stories carried uncomfortable remnants of truth. No consensus exists, and perhaps none will ever emerge. Silence is a difficult source to interrogate. Still, you feel the narrative shifting. Earlier, the hints were confined to scattered texts, scattered legends, scattered allusions. Now, for the first time, you see how institutional behavior itself forms part of the mystery. And that realization gently guides you toward a new threshold, one where silence gives way to action, and where the guardianship of secrets passes into the hands of those who would build an empire of warriors in the Holy Land. But for the moment, you remain here attuned to the quiet murmur beneath the Church's carefully curated story, a murmur that refuses to vanish even after 1,000 years of attempted forgetfulness. You step now into a world where silence gives way to structure, where whispers take shape as armor and vows, and where an idea, pure dangerous, or both, finds protectors bold enough to carve their presence into history. The rise of the Knights Templar did not happen in a vacuum. It unfolded at the precise intersection of political instability, religious fervor, and unresolved mysteries that stretched back centuries. And as you move through this moment in time, you sense how the threads you've followed so far, the migration stories in Gaul, the aura around the Merovingians, the Church's uneasy omissions, form a quiet undercurrent, flowing straight toward the Order's foundation. You start with the fact recorded in even the driest medieval chronicle in 1119. A small group of knights led by Hugues de Payens approached King Baldwin II in Jerusalem and proposed a radical idea. They would form a brotherhood, dedicated not to conquest, but to protection, specifically guarding pilgrims traveling the treacherous routes to the Holy City. Baldwin agreed, and soon afterward, the Church granted these knights residence on the Temple Mount itself. This unusual decision is the first spark of intrigue. After all, newly formed groups rarely received lodging atop the ruins of one of the most symbolically charged sites in the world. The placement alone hints that their purpose extended far beyond escort duty. As you linger on this moment, an obscure but telling detail surfaces earlier. Chroniclers mention that the Templars spent nearly a decade with very few members and almost no public activity. 10 years of near invisibility. 10 years in which their written contributions, records, and actions largely dissolve into silence. Some historians interpret this as administrative growing pains. Others note that the Temple Mount was a labyrinth of subterranean chambers, archives, and ruins from older civilizations. A decade spent in that setting raises questions that echo the themes you've been following since the beginning of this journey. Theories abound about what they were doing, but one debate has endured. Were they simply organizing themselves, or were they searching for something buried beneath centuries of conquest? Even cautious scholars acknowledge the possibility that they explored those underground corridors. After all, curiosity is as old as stone. And given the way earlier threads pointed toward hidden traditions in Gaul and suppressed narratives involving sacred ancestry, you begin to wonder whether part of the Templars' mission involved uncovering knowledge that had lain dormant since the 1st century. A small smile crosses your thoughts as you imagine a group of knights trying to explain 10 years of secretive digging using the medieval equivalent of "we were doing structural inspection." Bureaucracy would likely accept the explanation. Everyone else would raise an eyebrow. As you continue tracing their origins, something else becomes striking: the Order's meteoric rise. Within a single generation, the Templars transformed from an obscure band into one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. They acquired lands, wealth, military prestige, diplomatic access, and most curious of all, papal protection that freed them from taxation and oversight. Such privileges were not given lightly. Something about the Order inspired extraordinary confidence from those in power. One open question that fascinates scholars is whether this rapid elevation resulted solely from their military usefulness, or from information they possessed, information that gave them leverage or sacred legitimacy. The Church, already navigating the delicate balance between doctrinal uniformity and whispered alternative histories, would have greatly benefited from an ally capable of containing or guarding sensitive knowledge. And the Templars, disciplined and discreet, were ideal custodians for anything requiring silence. This idea gains weight when placed beside the earlier patterns you've observed: the Church's cautious handling of stories involving Mary Magdalene, the unresolved rumors in southern France, and the peculiar reverence once given to a dynasty whose ancestry seemed unusually significant. Imagine for a moment that fragments of that older lineage survived into the medieval period, passed quietly through families or communities. If such knowledge surfaced near the Temple Mount, a site already drenched in the origins of Christian narrative, the order founded there would have inherited far more than stone walls. A gentle laugh surfaces as you picture a medieval pope receiving a discreet message from Jerusalem and thinking, yes, let's grant this group every privilege imaginable while studiously avoiding any follow-up questions. Even institutions of great power occasionally prefer not to know too much. The Templars also emerged during a moment when Europe was redefining spiritual authority. Competing monastic reforms, theological disputes, and the Crusades created pressures that made the Church eager for stabilizing forces. An order that combined military discipline with absolute loyalty could serve as both sword and shield. If the Templars had access to ancient genealogical knowledge, whether symbolic or literal, it might explain why they became essential to the Church's political landscape. Their secrecy was not an obstacle, it was an asset. Another obscure detail worth noting is the way early Templar seals sometimes depict two riders on a single horse. Official interpretations say this symbolizes poverty, brotherhood, or shared resources. But some historians suggest a deeper meaning: the duality of their mission, both seen and unseen. Publicly, they protected pilgrims. Privately, they may have guarded stories or documents connecting ancient lineages to contemporary politics. The ambiguity of their imagery mirrors the ambiguity of their purpose, leaving you with questions that linger like incense in an old chapel. The open scholarly debate continues. Were the Templars custodians of forgotten traditions, or were they simply swept upward by political tides? There is no definitive answer. Yet the pattern remains compelling. They arose precisely where ancient stories converged on land, where biblical history unfolded, where suppressed narratives began, and where a hidden lineage, if it existed, would have left its earliest traces. You feel the narrative shifting once more. The Church's silence prepared the ground. The Templars' emergence provides structure. Their sudden access to power suggests motive, and their secrecy hints at inheritance. For now, you let their rise settle like dust on stone steps, knowing that the path ahead will lead you beneath the Temple Mount itself, where the echoes of deeper mysteries still wait. You descend now into the dimmest part of the story, so far, not metaphorically, but almost literally, because the next step in this investigation takes you beneath the surface of Jerusalem into the tunnels and chambers where the earliest Templars lived, prayed, and according to many accounts, dug with a determination that feels almost obsessive. The Temple Mount was not merely their headquarters. It was their mystery, their inheritance, and perhaps their true reason for existing. And as you move into those depths, you sense how every previous thread, the ancient silence around family lines, the whispers in Gaul, the strange reverence surrounding old dynasties, the Church's deliberate omissions, begins converging under the weight of stone thicker than memory. You begin, as always, with the anchor of a historical fact. The Templars were indeed granted quarters in the eastern part of the Temple Mount, in the structure known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Crusaders at the time believed this building stood atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple, the legendary storehouse of sacred relics, royal archives, and documents lost across centuries of conquest. Chroniclers note that the Templars occupied this site for years with unusual exclusivity. No other group was permitted routine access to the subterranean chambers beneath. Even their fellow Crusaders regarded the Order's underground activities as curious, if not entirely mysterious, because no one seemed to know exactly what they were doing down there. This leads naturally to an obscure but fascinating detail. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 19th and 20th centuries uncovered long, narrow tunnels, storage rooms, and chambers carved deep beneath the eastern platform spaces whose existence had not been fully recorded in medieval descriptions. Some of these cavities bear signs of deliberate excavation, consistent with tools used during the 12th century. Scholars debate whether the Templars created all of these passages, or merely expanded existing ones. But the presence of man-made cuts in the stone, dated to their period of occupation, suggests that digging was not incidental. It was purposeful, organized, and sustained. As you imagine the quiet intensity of those underground efforts, a small thread of humor slips into your thoughts. A group of armored knights spending years digging in the dark probably had moments when someone muttered, "This is not what I signed up for," only to be shushed by the commander, who believed something extraordinary lay just ahead. Even legendary warriors must have had their off days. But the real intrigue emerges when you consider why they continued their excavations with such persistence. One debate that continues among historians is whether the Templars believed ancient records, artifacts, or genealogical documents lay hidden beneath the mount. The possibility is not far-fetched. The temple complex had fallen multiple times across centuries to Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and each wave of destruction left behind layers of rubble relics and occasionally concealed chambers. If any group in medieval Europe had reason to search for ancient genealogies, sacred scrolls, or evidence of a lineage tied to Jesus, the Templars dwelling in the most symbolically charged archaeological site in the Western world would have had opportunity and motivation. You recall the idea that earlier rumors in Gaul pointed to documents carried by exiles who fled Judea. If such documents ever existed, imagine how powerful they would become if rediscovered by an elite military order entrusted with secrecy. Knowledge of lineage, real, symbolic, or imagined, could grant spiritual legitimacy, political leverage, or even a foundation for new dynastic alliances, and the Church, already navigating the theological balance explored earlier, might have seen value in containing such discoveries rather than broadcasting them. Another obscure element arises in the form of a reference from a 12th century chronicler who noted that the Templars searched the holy foundations with fervor as though seeking a treasure not of gold. The phrasing is peculiar. If he had simply meant relics, he could have said relics. The choice of language invites speculation that the treasure was something intangible, knowledge, secrets, documents of profound importance. A soft, amused thought drifts across your mind as you picture a knight stumbling on a dusty scroll after months of excavation and whispering, "This had better be important," before realizing the text inside contains names rather than gold. Even the Templars, stern as they were, might have cracked a rare smile at the idea that genealogy could hold more power than jewels. The open debate among modern archaeologists centers on whether the Templars actually found anything. Some argue there is no direct evidence of discovery. Others point out that medieval records describing their sudden rise in status and wealth coincide suspiciously with the period following their underground work. It is possible their newfound prestige came solely from their military role. But it is equally possible, though unproven, that they uncovered documents or relics that gave them undeniable leverage. The greatest tension lies here. If they did find something significant beneath the Temple Mount, they did not announce it. No triumphant declarations, no grand displays. Instead, their secrecy deepened, their influence expanded, their independence increased. and their relationship with the Church shifted into a partnership marked by unusual privileges and exemptions. As you let these possibilities unfold, another gentle moment of humor helps soften the gravity of speculation. You imagine a medieval bishop asking a Templar what they found underground, only to receive the world's vaguest answer: something interesting. Even today, that phrase could start a dozen conspiracy theories before breakfast. But beneath the humor lies a more serious recognition. The Templars operated under a code that prized secrecy as highly as faith. If they uncovered anything that challenged or enriched long-held narratives, especially anything related to lineage, they would have considered it something to guard, not display. And in guarding it, they may have positioned themselves as protectors, not just of pilgrims, but of history itself. The open question scholars still revisit is whether the Templars' time beneath the Temple Mount connects directly to later claims of lost archives, hidden relics, or genealogical traditions. No definitive answer exists, but the patterns are difficult to dismiss. Their decade of excavation coincided with their transformation from obscure knights into an order of tremendous influence. Their secrecy intensified, their symbols multiplied, and their reputation as guardians of dangerous knowledge took root. For now, you rise slowly from the underground corridors, carrying with you the sense that whatever began beneath the Temple Mount shaped the Order's identity long after they left Jerusalem. What they discovered, if they discovered anything, may have been the spark that illuminated the path toward mysteries still unfolding centuries later. You surface from the underground chambers of Jerusalem, with the distant echo of Picts and whispered theories still clinging to you, and now you move into a gentler but no less mysterious space, the realm of documents that may or may not have existed, may or may not have survived, and yet somehow shaped centuries of imagination. The so-called Grail documents, if they existed at all, would have been far more dangerous than any jeweled chalice. A cup can be stolen. A relic can be hidden. But a written genealogy, especially one that challenges the foundation of spiritual authority, carries weight that even kings and popes fear. And as you settle into this part of the investigation, you feel the narrative shifting from stone to parchment, from excavation to interpretation, from buried chambers to secrets inked into fragile lines. You begin with a fact that gives this chapter its first quiet pulse. Several medieval sources, mostly tangential, frustratingly vague, mention that the Templars possessed writings of great antiquity acquired during their early years in Jerusalem. None describe these documents in detail. None confirm their origin. But the references are consistent enough that even cautious historians concede the Templars were believed, at least by some contemporaries, to hold texts older than their order itself. These mentions do not confirm content, but they confirm reputation, and reputation has a way of shaping reality, even when evidence remains elusive. From this foundation, you turn toward the more obscure detail that sparked centuries of fascination. One obscure 14th-century chronicle written after the fall of the Templars describes rumors of a hidden record guarded by the Order, referring to it as the Grail, spelled in a way that suggests a concept rather than an object. This linguistic shift is significant. It suggests that the Grail, in at least one medieval imagination, was not a chalice at all, but a container of knowledge, perhaps genealogical, perhaps spiritual, perhaps both. The chronicle's author offers no explanation, only a cryptic warning that the loss of this record would scatter the truth to the winds. Such ambiguity is either maddening or magical, depending on your patience, but it undeniably widens the conceptual doorway through which the bloodline theory can enter. As you explore this territory, a small moment of humor drifts in. You imagine a Templar librarian, stern as an oak beam, labeling a hidden chest, "Do not open, only for future generations," to become obsessed with whatever lay inside. Human nature guarantees that the more you tell people not to look, the more desperately they want to. Still, your investigation remains grounded. You return to the idea raised earlier: if the Templars found documents beneath the Temple Mount, and if those documents concerned the early followers of Jesus, even genealogical remnants, then the Grail became not a relic of stone, but a relic of inheritance. The notion that the Grail represents a bloodline appears in medieval literature with surprising frequency, though often in symbolic form. The concept of a vessel, something that carries life, was reinterpreted by many storytellers long before modern authors revived the idea. In some versions of the Grail cycle, the object is less important than the family associated with it. A lineage, not a cup, carries the story. The scholarly debate grows sharpest here. Some academics argue that the association between the Grail and a bloodline results from later reinterpretations mixing medieval symbolism with modern myth-making. Others point out that the earliest Grail romances, especially those written by Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach, are filled with hints that the Grail's significance lies in ancestry rather than sanctity. One describes the Grail as a stone that sustains a chosen family. Another speaks of guardianship passed from generation to generation. Even if these are allegories, they reflect a cultural moment when lineage secrecy and sacred duty intertwined. You notice how comfortably this aligns with earlier patterns, the way suppressed Gospels suggested intimate teachings, the way Gaul held legends of hidden arrivals, the way Merovingian kings carried an aura of ancient inheritance, and the way the Church navigated uneasy silences. If a genealogical narrative persisted through centuries in whispers and fragments, the Templars, positioned at the crossroads of Jerusalem's deepest histories, would have been uniquely placed to discover parts of it. An obscure but compelling detail adds another layer. Some accounts of the Templar trials mention interrogators asking specifically about scrolls and books believed to contain forbidden teachings. While many accusations during the trials were exaggerated or fabricated, the persistence of questions about documents suggests that inquisitors believed such writings existed. Whether they sought doctrinal deviations or genealogical secrets is unclear. But the mere fact that questioning focused heavily on texts reinforces the idea that the order was associated with dangerous knowledge rather than only military threat. A soft smile crosses your thoughts as you imagine a Templar attempting to explain to an inquisitor that the dangerous secret was simply a list of supplies only for the interrogator to respond. No one hides flour inventory in a sealed chest. Even humor reminds you that secrecy often appears more ominous than reality. Yet in this case, the shadows feel substantial. The open question that scholars continue to debate, sometimes passionately, sometimes exasperatedly, is whether the Grail documents, if they existed, preserved a memory of Jesus' lineage that contradicts later doctrine. Some argue that even if the documents did not survive, the Templars' reputation for guarding them influenced the development of later secret societies. Others suggest that the documents might have existed, but contained symbolic genealogies rather than literal ones. And still others maintain that the entire theory stems from misinterpretation of medieval literature. But what stands out most as you linger here is the consistency of the pattern. Whenever you approach the edges of lineage-related mysteries, you find the Templars already there, sometimes digging, sometimes guarding, sometimes remaining suspiciously silent. Whether that silence protected truth or protected myth remains uncertain. You let the possibilities settle around you like dust drifting through candlelight. The Grail documents may have been lost, destroyed, or simply invented by anxious imaginations. or they may have been the bridge between ancient whispers and the symbolic traditions that followed. Whatever the truth you sense, that the next step in this journey will take you into the realm of symbolism itself, where chalices become metaphors, blood becomes lineage, and medieval art hides meanings too delicate to speak aloud. You drift now into the realm where symbol and story intertwine so tightly that undoing them feels almost impossible. Yet this is exactly where the mystery guides you next, because once the idea of the Grail shifts from object to concept and from concept to lineage, everything about medieval storytelling takes on new dimensions. You are no longer dealing with chalices, cups, or sacred vessels. You are dealing with metaphors constructed carefully enough to conceal meaning while still letting certain truths pass quietly from century to century. And as you let your attention soften into this symbolic landscape, you begin to see how myth becomes a protective veil hiding something fragile beneath the surface. You anchor yourself first in a historical certainty. The earliest Grail romances emerged in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, beginning with Chrétien de Troyes and evolving rapidly through additional cycles. These stories appeared after the Templars had already risen to prominence, and during the period when they were most deeply embedded in both popular imagination and theological politics. That timing is not accidental. Stories thrive where cultural tension needs expression, and Europe at the time was rich with tensions, spiritual, political, and ideological. The Grail romances became a canvas onto which anxieties and aspirations could be painted. But as you read these stories with the patience of someone tracing symbols, you notice something curious. The Grail is rarely described as a simple chalice. Chrétien never calls it a cup. Wolfram describes it as a stone. Later authors portray it as a vessel that sustains life, grants healing, or chooses families. Even when it appears cup-like, it behaves less like an object and more like an inheritance. Something passed down, guarded and linked to blood rather than ritual. This is where symbolic interpretation begins to align with the possibility that the Grail was never meant to be a physical relic. Instead, it might have served as a coded representation of a lineage whose existence was too controversial to name openly. An obscure but significant detail emerges in Wolfram's Parzival, where the guardians of the Grail are not knights serving a relic, but members of a family chosen by birthright. Their authority does not come from elevation by the church, it comes from descent. In a world obsessed with dynastic legitimacy, this is an unusual, even provocative structure. If the Grail symbolized divine inheritance, then the guardians of the Grail were protectors not of a cup, but of a bloodline. The text never says this plainly, but the symbolism leans heavily in that direction. A soft laugh rises in your thoughts as you picture a medieval writer sitting alone with quill in hand, thinking, I can't say it directly, but maybe a stone that chooses heirs will get the point across. Symbolism, after all, was the medieval version of winking at the audience. Still, you ground yourself again. Not all scholars agree that these symbolic cues refer to lineage. Some interpret them as metaphors for spiritual purity or mystical knowledge. Others argue that medieval audiences loved allegory for its own sake. Yet the open question remains unresolved. Why do so many Grail stories imply continuity through generations rather than through objects? Why do so many guardians appear bound not by vows, but by heritage? And why does the Grail itself seem less like a cup, used once in a ritual, and more like a vessel of life? Something that carries, contains, or transmits. As these questions form, you notice how the symbolic language echoes much of what you've already encountered. The suppressed Gospels hinted at intimate teachings. The traditions in Gaul spoke of a woman carrying something precious. The Merovingians possessed legends of sacred birth and extraordinary ancestry. The Church's silence grew thickest whenever familial narratives threatened doctrinal clarity. And the Templars positioned at the nexus of these threads became associated with texts described not as relics, but as secrets. Each layer deepens the resonance of the idea that the Grail, a vessel, might have represented not a cup that held wine, but a person who carried lineage. Another layer of symbolism emerges in the way certain medieval artworks portray the Grail quest. In some depictions, the Grail appears surrounded by imagery associated with fertility, continuity, or heritage. These associations may be artistic coincidence, or they may be fragments of an older, quieter tradition preserved by painters who understood symbolism as a language accessible only to those attuned to its vocabulary. You imagine a medieval artist working under candlelight slipping coded imagery into a fresco the way someone today might hide a secret reference in a film. Even the past enjoyed its subtleties. An obscure reference from a 13th century commentary, rarely discussed outside specialist circles, mentions that the Grail preserves the rightful heirs. The phrasing is ambiguous as always, but that ambiguity leaves space for the interpretation that the Grail's function is protective rather than sacramental. If so, the Grail becomes a family secret, not a liturgical object. The open debate that continues today revolves around whether these symbolic patterns reflect memories of a suppressed tradition, or whether they represent purely literary invention. Scholars who argue for invention point to the creative nature of medieval romance. Those who argue for historical memory point to the remarkable consistency across independent authors writing in different regions and eras. If symbolism emerged independently, yet matched across versions what inspired it? Why did multiple storytellers equate the Grail with lineage? And why does the earliest surviving reference describe it not as an object used at the Last Supper, but as something carried into a procession, something alive with ritual gravitas? A gentle moment of humor slips in as you imagine the Templars observing these stories, gaining popularity, and thinking, well, this is going to complicate things as their own reputation became entangled with legends they may never have intended to influence. Secrecy, it seems, has a habit of generating its own mythology. Yet despite the jokes, you sense the gravity of what symbolism can achieve. When truths cannot be spoken, they become metaphors. When metaphors are repeated for centuries, they become legends. And when legends echo too closely to historical silences, they become directions for the curious. The Grail, as a symbol of lineage, does not prove the existence of a bloodline, but it widens the path, softens the resistance, and invites a gentler understanding of how stories evolve to protect fragile truths. A cup is simple to explain. A lineage is impossible to control. And perhaps that is exactly why the Grail became a story rather than an artifact. For now, you let the symbol settle beside you like a quiet companion, knowing that its next transformation will appear not in text, but in art carved into stone waiting patiently for curious eyes to notice. You move now from stories written in language to stories written in stone, stepping into the cool, echoing chambers of Templar architecture, where silence is not emptiness, but intention. The order rarely wrote openly about its inner beliefs, but it built expansively, leaving behind churches, chapels, tombs, seals, and carvings that speak in their own quiet dialect. If the Templars ever wished to preserve a truth without recording it, plainly, art would have been the perfect medium, visible to everyone, understood by few. And as you let your gaze soften into this symbolic landscape, you begin noticing patterns that feel less like decoration and more like a guarded whisper. You start with the one fact no historian disputes: Templar architecture is distinct. Their round churches, modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, reflect a devotion to origins rather than innovation. The geometry is deliberate echoing symmetry, found in ancient structures associated with burial resurrection and continuity. Roundness in sacred architecture often signifies eternity, unbroken cycles, or perpetuation through generations. It is not a proof of lineage narratives, but it forms a symbolic foundation for interpreting the art inside these walls. As you lean into these images, an obscure detail emerges, one that often slides past casual observers. Many Templar chapels include carvings of a woman depicted with unusual prominence. She appears not as a distant saint, but as a central figure, sometimes gesturing toward an open book, sometimes pointing toward a winding vine, sometimes standing beside a knight in a posture that suggests partnership rather than subordination. Scholars debate whether this woman represents Mary Magdalene Sophia Ecclesia or a generalized symbol of divine wisdom, but the consistency of her presence in Templar sites, especially in France and Portugal, invites deeper curiosity. You can't help but recall the earlier threads of this investigation, the suppressed Gospels emphasizing Mary Magdalene's authority, the legends of her arrival in Gaul, and the symbolism woven through Grail narratives. Each time you approach a motif of feminine wisdom or sacred lineage, the same silhouette appears, as though her shadow is stitched into the margins of history by design. And in these carvings, she stands quietly waiting to be seen. Another subtle touch in Templar artwork involves the motif of vines winding, branching, intertwining across capitals, borders, and arches. In medieval symbolism, vines often represent family lines, origins, or continuity through generations. The Church commonly used vine imagery to represent spiritual lineage, but the Templars often depict vines in ways that seem to emphasize human ancestry rather than metaphorical growth. Sometimes the vines weave into patterns that resemble genealogical trees. Sometimes they form closed loops suggesting preserved lineage. Sometimes they frame female figures rather than Christ or apostles. These choices may be incidental, or they may represent deliberate encoding meant to protect ideas too sensitive for open discussion. A quiet smile crosses your thoughts as you imagine a Templar sculptor working late at night, carving a tiny symbolic flourish into a column, muttering something like, "No one will notice this unless they're really paying attention," unaware that centuries later, thousands of people would be squinting at his work through the glass of museum displays. Even secretive orders probably didn't anticipate how devoted future audiences would become to decoding their art. The open debate among art historians centers on whether Templar symbolism truly hides esoteric teachings, or whether these interpretations simply arise from modern fascination. Some scholars argue that round churches and vine motifs reflect general medieval artistic trends. Others counter that Templar art displays enough unusual consistency and enough deviations from standard ecclesiastical iconography to suggest intentional messaging. The way certain symbols cluster in regions associated with earlier Magdalene traditions only adds to the intrigue. One obscure carving becomes particularly difficult to dismiss. In a Templar church in central France, a relief shows a knight kneeling before a woman, holding what appears to be a scroll. The scroll's surface is blank either intentionally or because time erased the markings, but the composition is striking. The knight does not raise his sword in fealty. He bows as though receiving instruction. And the woman stands not as a saint performing a miracle, but as someone granting knowledge. Scholars have offered numerous interpretations, but the gesture feels too intimate, too grounded, too human to represent a generic allegory. You recall the earlier possibility that the Templars inherited or discovered documents related to early Christian genealogy. If so, a scroll in a woman's hands, especially depicted within Templar architecture, could be a nod toward origins the order was forbidden to articulate openly. Whether literal or symbolic, the pairing of feminine authority and written lineage echoes themes established long before the Templars ever lifted a sword. A soft laugh surfaces as you imagine a modern tourist staring at that carving, whispering dramatically, "This is definitely the Da Vinci Code," before misreading half the plaque. Interpretation is always a spectrum, and the ability to find patterns often outpaces the ability to confirm them. Still, even humor cannot entirely dissolve the sense that these carvings carry messages meant for more discerning eyes. The open question that scholars continue to wrestle with is whether such symbols represent remnants of older beliefs circulating within the order, or whether they reflect Templar exposure to traditions encountered in the Holy Land. The vines, the female figures, the scrolls all appear in Eastern Christian iconography as well, especially in communities with early connections to Mary Magdalene traditions. If the Templars interacted with such groups as many historians believe, their art may have absorbed symbolic cues passed down through generations. And yet, despite the richness of interpretation, nothing in Templar art ever states anything plainly. The order seemed to favor suggestion over declaration, metaphor over proclamation, subtlety over certainty. This silence echoes the patterns you found earlier within the Church, those areas where omission rather than clarity becomes the most telling feature. Perhaps secrecy was not merely habit, but heritage, and so you stand quietly among the carvings, letting the stone speak in its calm, cryptic way. In its curves and shadows, you sense lineage. In its figures, you sense continuity. In its patterns, you sense a guarded truth, offering hints but never boasting. If the Templars wished to preserve a secret without betraying it, this is exactly how they would have done it. For now, you let the images settle into your awareness like soft chalk dust, knowing that the next turn in the journey leads from sculpture to sealed parchment, where the Templars hid their most guarded messages. You move now from stone to parchment, from carvings that whisper to documents that refuse to speak at all unless you handle them with patience. Templar charters, especially the sealed ones, form a strange category in medieval archives. They are official enough to survive, mysterious enough to invite speculation, and silent enough to fuel centuries of curiosity. These charters were often written for internal use, safeguarded in chests and sealed with wax impressions that look more like quiet warnings than administrative marks. And as you ease into this part of the investigation, you feel the tension tightening because written documents, unlike art or rumor, carry the weight of deliberate intention. You anchor yourself with a fact that is not contested. The Templars produced an enormous number of legal documents during their rise across Europe: property grants, permissions agreements, and records of donation. But among these are a small subset of charters that are markedly different. They reference undisclosed privileges, confidential instructions, or special knowledge granted to certain commanders. Their language is unusually guarded, even by medieval standards. Some include blank sections where details appear intentionally omitted, as if the parchment is telling you that something important existed but was never meant to be spelled out. These peculiar absences form the first step into the deeper shadows of Templar administration. Within this shadowed world, you encounter an obscure detail that has puzzled archivists for more than a century. Several sealed charters preserved in the archives of French monasteries contain encrypted phrases, short lines written in cipher rather than plain Latin. The ciphers have never been fully decoded. Some scholars believe they reference financial arrangements or troop movements. Others suggest they protect sensitive names or genealogical connections. The most curious aspect is that these encoded phrases appear only in documents produced after the Templars' early years in Jerusalem, almost as if the order began safeguarding something new or newly discovered that required coded language to prevent accidental exposure. A small moment of humor drifts into your thoughts as you imagine a medieval clerk confronted with a cipher instruction from his commander and muttering, "Great, now I get to invent secret handwriting." Even administrative secrecy has a human side complete with sighs and scratched-out mistakes. But the secrecy embedded in these charters quickly deepens. Some documents from the early 13th century reference the matter entrusted to the elders without offering any clarification. Historians frequently interpret this phrase as referring to internal governance or ritual practices. Yet when you place it beside everything you've uncovered so far, the suppressed traditions, the lineage symbolism, the whispers around hidden documents, it begins to feel like the tip of something larger. The elders may have been custodians of teachings or knowledge not intended for the younger brothers of the order, let alone the outside world. One open debate among scholars centers on why the Templars needed such compartmentalized secrecy. Administrative secrecy is normal for military orders, but encrypted lines in legal charters, references to unnamed matters, and strict internal hierarchies suggest a deeper structure of knowledge preservation. The question becomes whether the Templars were protecting information relating to political alliances, financial holdings, or something more ancient, something that would intertwine with the lineage narratives emerging from the Holy Land. At this point, the narrative arcs backward as earlier threads from the investigation slip naturally into this moment. If the Templars uncovered documents beneath the Temple Mount or encountered traditions preserved by Eastern Christian groups, then those discoveries could easily have carried implications too explosive for open circulation. Genealogy, as you've seen, can destabilize both church and crown. Even the hint of a bloodline tied to Jesus could challenge doctrine's royal claims and social hierarchies. Keeping that kind of knowledge in sealed charters, encoded and protected, would have been a strategic necessity. Another obscure detail emerges from the Templar trial records. During interrogations, several members under duress, exhaustion, or fear admitted that the order maintained hidden writings kept only by high-ranking officials. No one described these writings clearly. No one named their contents. But the fact that interrogators repeatedly pressed for details about secret texts suggests such rumors were widespread enough to merit official concern. Whether these writings contained alternative teachings, genealogical references, or symbolic rituals remains one of the enduring uncertainties of Templar history. A soft laugh flutters into your thoughts as you imagine a Templar master sitting before his captors, realizing that the safest thing to say is both true and useless. We have important documents that mean nothing to anyone, which of course only makes the inquisitors lean in closer. Sometimes secrecy fuels more curiosity than confession. Yet within the levity, you sense a deeper structure. The Templars organized their internal documents into layers. Outer layers for mundane records, middle layers for operational instructions, inner layers for knowledge restricted to the highest ranks. These inner layers often included sealed charters, documents so sensitive that even some commanders were not permitted to view them without explicit authorization. This pattern mirrors monastic traditions that protected sacred or controversial texts behind layers of ritual access. It also mirrors earlier Christian groups who preserved teachings in private circles rather than public sermons. The open scholarly question that remains is whether any of these sealed charters contained fragments of genealogical history from the earliest Christian era. The possibility is tantalizing. Imagine a document outlining family connections, inheritance lines, or coded references to descendants protected in Gaul. Such a document would not survive open transmission. It would need guardians' secrecy and an order disciplined enough to preserve it across generations without revealing it. You step back gently, letting the weight of these sealed documents settle into your awareness. None of them speak plainly. None of them offer definitive proof. But their structure, their secrecy, their encryption, and their timing all shimmer with the same pattern you have been tracing since the beginning. A pattern in which silence becomes evidence and omission becomes a clue. A final light moment drifts through your thoughts as you imagine one of these charters slipping from a dusty chest centuries later, only for a startled archivist to mutter, "This looks important," before placing it carefully back and pretending he didn't see it. Even now, the past protects itself. And so you move forward, leaving the sealed parchments behind, knowing that the next step in the mystery leads from administrative secrecy to explosive influence. Because whatever the Templars guarded, it altered the balance of power across Europe. You step now into the bright, almost blinding phase of the Templar story, the moment when an order that began with fewer than a dozen knights suddenly rose to a level of wealth, authority, and political reach that rivaled kings. This ascent did not happen gradually. It surged like a tide, spreading across Europe with such speed and confidence that even contemporaries felt the shift. And as you move into this chapter of the investigation, you can't help noticing how perfectly this transformation aligns with the period when their secrecy deepened, their underground excavations ended, and their encoded documents began to appear. Influence of this scale does not arise from swordsmanship alone. Something else, something deeper, was shaping their rise. You begin with the solid historical fact that anchors this investigation. By the mid-12th century, the Templars had transformed into one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom. They controlled castles, fleets, agricultural estates, supply routes, and diplomatic networks stretching from Scotland to Jerusalem. They became bankers to kings, treasurers for the church, and administrators of vast estates. Their exemption from local laws and taxes granted directly by the Pope made them nearly untouchable. Contemporary rulers grumbled that the Templars behaved like a kingdom within a kingdom, a state whose borders existed wherever their white mantles appeared. No military order before or after rose as rapidly or as dramatically. But as you move closer to their ascent, an obscure detail emerges from early French charters. By the 1140s, donors began giving the Templars land without being asked. This reversal of typical monastic fundraising suggests something unusual. People seemed eager to place assets under Templar protection. Some historians interpret this as trust in their spiritual mission. Others see financial pragmatism. Yet the pattern is strongest in regions associated with earlier Magdalene legends and Merovingian memory, which raises the question of whether the Templars' reputation extended beyond military service into realms of symbolic guardianship. Trust, after all, often forms around mystery. A soft laugh bubbles through your thoughts as you imagine a medieval landowner saying, "I have no heirs, but these armored men with a secret basement energy seem trustworthy." Even centuries later, the logic feels oddly familiar. You sense the subtle pull of earlier threads, those hidden traditions in Gaul, the sacred aura around the Merovingians, the whispers in suppressed texts. If remnants of a lineage narrative survived into the medieval period, the Templars' sudden authority could reflect more than mere political convenience. A group believed to possess ancient knowledge or genealogical truth would attract loyalty that transcended law or military might. It would attract devotion. The open scholarly debate grows sharper here. Some historians argue the Templars' rise stemmed solely from outstanding organization and military skill. And indeed, they were fierce warriors, disciplined beyond many knightly peers, often fighting to the last man in battle. But organizational skill alone cannot explain how within one generation they became the trusted custodians of royal treasures. papal archives, diplomatic secrets, and private correspondence between monarchs. Influence of this magnitude hints at leverage, perhaps something discovered in Jerusalem, or something inherited through traditions older than the order itself. Another obscure detail adds to the intrigue. Records from the Iberian Peninsula reveal that several kings granted the Templars privileges normally reserved for blood relatives. In one case, a king entrusted them with lands designated for heirs in perpetuity, language typically used for dynastic succession rather than monastic guardianship. Scholars disagree on whether this phrasing reflects political expediency or symbolic recognition of the order's perceived legitimacy. But it dovetails curiously with lineage-oriented themes already woven through this investigation. A gentle moment of humor sneaks in as you imagine a royal scribe writing the charter, pausing mid-sentence and thinking, "Should I really use heir terminology here?" before shrugging and continuing. Even official documents sometimes reveal more than intended. As their influence expanded, so too did the unease surrounding them. Medieval kings began grumbling that the Templars answered to no earthly power, not even the crown. Monarchs found themselves indebted financially and politically to an order whose loyalties lay elsewhere. Some chroniclers describe the Templars as guardians of secrets not meant for kings, a phrase that seems melodramatic until you consider the possibility that they held knowledge capable of unsettling political hierarchies. And then you remember the sealed charters, the encoded lines, the references to matters entrusted only to elders, and the underground decade beneath the Temple Mount. As you let these threads settle in one place, the picture becomes clearer. The Templars' rise was not random. It aligned with events that suggest they possessed something: knowledge, documents, or authority beyond military function. The open question that still stirs debate is what exactly they guarded. Financial systems, religious relics, diplomatic secrets, or something far more ancient, perhaps genealogical records linking medieval Europe to the earliest roots of Christianity. No consensus exists. Yet the pattern remains: when the Templars arrived in Europe with newfound prominence, their influence grew fastest in regions steeped in older lineage legends. It is as though their presence resonated with stories already circulating quietly among local families. A soft laugh crosses your thoughts again, as you imagine the Templars trying to keep a low profile while accumulating more influence than any religious order in recorded history. "Blend in," someone must have said while signing a papal exemption or receiving another castle. Yet beneath the humor, you feel the narrative narrowing. The Templars' rise was not just powerful, it was destabilizing. Their independence threatened monarchs. Their secrecy irritated bishops. Their influence extended too far too quickly for comfort. And when institutions feel threatened, they search for weaknesses. The Templars had one: their silence created space for suspicion. Suspicion created pressure, and pressure created enemies. Enemies who would reshape their legacy and perhaps bury the very secrets that fueled their ascent. You step now into the colder part of the story, where admiration bends into suspicion, and the bright rise of the Templars begins casting shadows long enough for monarchs, clerics, and rivals to grow uneasy. Influence, when it grows too quickly, becomes indistinguishable from threat. And the Templars, disciplined, wealthy, untaxed, mobile, and mysteriously well-informed, were the sort of threat that made powerful people whisper behind closed doors. As you ease into this chapter, you feel the temperature shift. This is where alliances strain, where silence becomes ammunition, and where the secret they guarded, whatever its nature, begins attracting enemies who fear what the order represents far more than what it actually does. You begin with a detail grounded in the historical record. By the late 13th century, the Templars were no longer merely a military force. They functioned as bankers, couriers, diplomats, and custodians of sensitive information for nearly every royal house in Europe. Their network stretched farther and operated faster than most governments. Kings trusted them with treasure and intelligence, but increasingly feared the independence that came with such trust. The order answered only to the Pope, and even that loyalty was complicated by the Templars' habit of guarding internal knowledge with fierce discretion. The first major adversary to emerge was one you've encountered before, though only at the edges: the French monarchy. The Capetian kings inherited territories layered with legends of ancient arrivals, Magdalene traditions, and Merovingian claims stories that overlapped awkwardly with regions where the Templars held influence. As anxieties deepened, something unsettling appeared in royal correspondence. Surviving letters hint that the monarchy believed the Templars possessed knowledge dangerous to the crown. The letters never specify what that knowledge was, but the phrasing echoes the unease you've been tracing since the beginning. An obscure but revealing detail emerges from a Burgundian chronicle. The author notes that certain nobles in southern France treated the Templars with a reverence that exceeded their regard for kings. Such unusual loyalty could be interpreted as devotion, or as belief that the Templars held access to something older and more legitimate than political authority. If whispers of ancient lineages still lingered among families in those regions, the order's symbolic presence would have carried weight far beyond battlefield heroics. A soft flicker of humor touches your thoughts as you imagine the French king hearing rumors that a group of monks with swords commanded more reverence than he did. "Absolutely not," he would mutter, summoning his council with the energy of someone who refuses to be upstaged by men in white cloaks. Even royal egos need room to breathe. Yet humor does not soften the reality that monarchs began perceiving the order less as protectors and more as rivals. The Templars' wealth rivaled national treasuries. Their fortresses dotted strategic landscapes. Their secrets, particularly the sealed charters and unknown documents, invited suspicion. Kings depend on information, and the Templars kept theirs in-house. Another subtle tension came from the Church itself. Although the Templars were protected by papal authority, certain theologians viewed their autonomy as a threat to clerical hierarchy. A few expressed discomfort with the order's privileged access to Temple Mount traditions, suspecting that the Knights had inherited stories or teachings that diverged from official doctrine. One obscure cleric in the 13th century wrote that the brothers hold truths not fitting for public faith, an ambiguous line that could refer to mysticism or something genealogical. The lack of clarity is precisely why the rumor persisted. A gentle laugh escapes you as you picture a bishop trying to explain the Templars to a worried flock. Yes, they are holy warriors, yes, they are wealthy, and yes, they may know things we don't, but please don't panic. A sentence guaranteed to make everyone panic. Meanwhile, tensions grew sharper in Iberia, where kings relied heavily on the Templars in battles against rival kingdoms. Several monarchs expressed frustration that the order seemed to operate with its own priorities. Again and again, accusations emerged that the Templars possessed private histories, a phrase that reappears in multiple regional accounts. Whether these histories were financial records, lineage documents, or symbolic narratives remains debated, but the repetition across independent sources hints at deeper worries. You notice how these concerns echo earlier threads: whispers of a hidden family in Gaul, the mystique of the Merovingians, suppressed gospels that emphasized alternate authority structures. If the Templars inherited or uncovered any information connected to those older mysteries, it would have been enough to unsettle monarchs already struggling to maintain legitimacy. Then comes the open question that continues to divide modern scholars: did the Templars' enemies target them because of genuine misconduct, or because their secrecy provided the perfect canvas onto which fear could be projected? The order's eventual downfall, accelerated by King Philip IV of France, was fueled by charges so extreme they bordered on absurdity. Yet beneath the fabricated accusations lies a deeper motivation seizing Templar wealth and neutralizing their independence. A soft gleam of humor returns as you imagine one royal advisor urging Philip's sire, "Perhaps we should not accuse them of everything imaginable only for the king to reply, 'Nonsense, accuse them of more.'" History sadly confirms that political convenience often triumphs over reason. But the deeper pattern remains clear. The Templars had grown too independent, too wealthy, too connected, and too silent at a time when monarchs sought control and the Church sought conformity. Their reputation for guarding hidden knowledge made them dangerous, not because of what they revealed, but because of what they might reveal. In a world built on delicate hierarchies, even the suggestion of an ancient lineage, one that rivaled royal blood or complicated doctrinal purity, would have been enough to unsettle the balance of power. The open scholarly debate remains unresolved. Were the Templars truly in possession of explosive knowledge, or did their enemies project that belief onto them? No consensus exists. Yet as you trace this path, the alignment between their rising influence, their deepening secrecy, and the anxieties of kings and clerics becomes too consistent to ignore. For now, you step quietly away from the gathering storm, aware that the enemies forming around the order will shape the next phase of this mystery, one in which persecution, confiscation, and disappearance will raise more questions than they answer. You move now into the darkest turn of the story, where pressure condenses into collapse, where fear outweighs reason, and where an order that once stood unshakable begins to fracture under the weight of accusation and ambition. The fall of the Templars is often told as a tale of greed or political convenience, but as you step softly into this moment, you feel something deeper humming beneath the familiar narrative. This is where the question that has followed you since the beginning, the question of what the Templars knew, suddenly becomes sharper. Because when the order fell, something else fell with them, the archives that no one was allowed to see. You begin with the fact no historian contests on Friday, October 13th, 1307. King Philip IV of France ordered the sudden and coordinated arrest of every Templar within his reach. The accusations were sweeping, grotesque, and largely implausible: ritual blasphemy, secret idols, financial corruption, conspiracies against the crown. The timing, however, was unmistakably strategic. Philip owed the Templars enormous sums of money, resented their independence, and had been denied membership in the order. His motives were political, financial, and deeply personal. Yet even these motives do not explain the full scale of what followed. As the arrests unfolded, an obscure but significant detail surfaced. Investigators seized Templar properties, but in many key sites, including their Paris headquarters, the most confidential records had vanished. Not stolen by outsiders, not destroyed hastily, simply gone. Witnesses described chests emptied before officials arrived and strong rooms left conspicuously bare. It is as though the order knew the strike was coming and acted with unnerving precision to protect whatever documents mattered most. A small thread of humor flits across your thoughts as you imagine one Templar telling another, "Pack the important things," and the other responding, "Which ones?" only to receive the whisper, "You know exactly which." Even in the face of catastrophe, secrecy remained a discipline. But the disappearance of the archives is more than a logistical curiosity. It connects directly to the earlier patterns you've been following: encoded charters, sealed writings, mysterious references to the matter entrusted to the elders, and the sudden rise of the order after their time beneath the Temple Mount. These themes now converge at the moment their internal records vanish. If the Templars had ever possessed information tied to ancient genealogies, lost teachings, or politically explosive narratives, this would have been the moment to remove such evidence from the reach of kings and inquisitors. One of the more obscure details from trial documents deepens the intrigue. Interrogators repeatedly questioned high-ranking Templars about texts said to be kept in the custody of the master and his intimates. They asked about scrolls, about books, about writings not meant for all brothers. Yet none of the accused ever admitted the contents. Some denied the texts existed. Others fell into exhausted silence. One elderly knight, pressed for hours, finally murmured that there were things best not spoken, a phrase that historians quote often because it feels like a crack through which older mysteries briefly shine. You recall how earlier clues pointed toward buried lineage narratives, traditions carried from Judea, and symbolic hints in medieval art. Now imagine how a king already paranoid, deeply indebted, and politically cornered might react to rumors that the Templars possessed documents capable of rewriting spiritual authority or legitimizing rival lineages. Even the suggestion of such texts could destabilize the monarchy. It could unsettle the church. It could shift the axis of power in ways too unpredictable to tolerate. This helps explain an inconvenient detail. Philip's campaign against the Templars was so abrupt, so sweeping, and so theatrically violent that it feels disproportionate to the charges presented. Kings rarely expend this much energy eliminating a mere financial rival, but kings have expended far more energy suppressing threats to legitimacy, especially those tied to lineage. A quiet laugh touches your thoughts as you picture Philip furious at the order's independence, saying they must be hiding something, while advisors whisper back, "Sire, you're the only one shouting." Yet even humor cannot entirely dissolve the intensity of his obsession. As the trials dragged on, the Templars' secrecy only deepened suspicion. Several brothers under torture mentioned rituals they barely understood. Others described oaths of silence concerning matters from the Holy Land. None of this qualifies as proof of genealogical secrets, but the ambiguity acted like tinder in a political wildfire. Ambiguity always does. And then comes the most haunting detail of all: the fleet. In 1307, as French officials moved to seize Templar assets, witnesses reported seeing a convoy of Templar ships depart from the port of La Rochelle and vanish into the Atlantic. No cargo manifests survive. No records explain where they went. The disappearance of the fleet, combined with the disappearance of the archives, has fueled centuries of speculation. Were they carrying treasure, relics, documents, people? Or something far more delicate, a lineage preserved through time? The open scholarly debate remains fierce. Some historians argue the fleet carried gold. Others believe the fleet is a myth. Still others point to regional records suggesting Templars sought refuge in Scotland, which at the time stood excommunicated and therefore beyond papal reach. It is possible that whatever was placed aboard those ships resurfaced centuries later in altered forms, rituals, symbols, or traditions within successor groups. But the truth remains hidden behind the same silence that shaped the order from the beginning. Another soft smile crosses your thoughts as you imagine modern archivists dreaming of finding the lost Templar library, only to uncover a box of medieval grocery lists. Real history is rarely as cinematic as we hope, but this mystery, strangely enough, might be the exception. At the end of this chapter, you feel the weight of a realization settling gently around you. The Templars' fall did not bury their secrets. It scattered them, and secrets once scattered have a habit of taking root in unexpected places, especially in lands where older stories were already waiting. For now, you step away from the ashes of the order, aware that some of its members survived, carrying with them whatever knowledge the archives once protected. Their escape begins the next phase of the mystery, one shaped no longer by power, but by preservation. You step gently out of the smoke and ruin of the Templars' fall and into a quieter, almost breath-held moment in history, the moment after catastrophe, when those who remain slip into the shadows and begin moving along paths no chronicler was meant to follow. The arrests were sweeping, the accusations overwhelming, and the political theater brutal. Yet despite the force applied against them, the order did not disappear entirely. Survivors, scattered, regrouped, disguised themselves and carried with them something far more valuable than wealth or relics: knowledge. And as you settle into this part of the investigation, you begin to feel the way those hidden fragments carried by living people, rather than fragile parchment, expanded outward, like an underground root system that refused to die. You begin with a historical fact that provides your first steadying foothold. While France captured the largest number of Templars, many brothers across Europe were never arrested at all. In Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Scotland, the order dissolved unevenly, sometimes slowly, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes in name only. Local rulers, especially in Iberia, simply recreated the order under new titles to protect its members and assets. These transformations were not subtle. Documents from the 14th century show entire commanderies reassigned to new organizations overnight, as if changing a name could erase the memory of what had been. Yet beneath the paperwork, many of the same knights, chaplains, and commanders remained in place. Their vows were redirected, not broken. The open question among scholars is whether these survivors preserved more than lands and titles. Some historians insist the surviving brothers retained only their skill and discipline. Others argue they protected something older, something connected to the sealed charters, the missing archives, the mysterious fleet, and the sudden silence that fell over anything related to their internal knowledge. You can feel how easily these possibilities bleed into one another, forming a narrative that moves underground not by force, but by necessity. And this is where one of the more obscure details becomes especially intriguing. In the decades following the fall, scattered references appear in regional chronicles describing traveling brothers who sought refuge with trusted noble families, particularly in areas associated with older Magdalene legends and Merovingian memory. These traveling brothers were said to carry letters of introduction that no one dared reproduce, and they often arrived at night, staying only long enough to confer privately with local leaders before continuing on. The chroniclers never describe the contents of their conversations, but the pattern alone suggests a network that outlived the order's official dissolution. A soft smile touches your thoughts as you imagine one of these wandering knights knocking on a manor door, whispering, "I'm here on important business," while the startled householder responds, "Couldn't you have written first?" Even fugitives, after all, must rely on hospitality, but hospitality alone cannot explain the consistency of these appearances. Several chronicles mention that some survivors carried chests small enough to strap to a saddle. Whether these chests contained relics, money letters, or fragments of the lost archives remains uncertain. Yet the language used to describe them, kept close, never opened in public, passed only to trusted hands, echoes the secrecy you've seen threaded throughout the Templar story from the beginning. Another layer of the underground network emerges when you consider Scotland, one of the few places where papal authority held no jurisdiction during the persecutions. According to accounts written a century later, a group of Templars reached Scotland shortly before the Battle of Bannockburn and offered their services to Robert the Bruce. The historicity of their battlefield presence remains debated, but what matters for your investigation is that Scotland became a sanctuary, one of the few places where a small group of survivors could regroup without immediate threat. And once again, the symbolism aligns Scotland with its long heritage of clan lineage and ritual tradition, provided fertile ground for any knowledge rooted in ancestry. A soft laugh drifts through your thoughts as you imagine Scottish nobles trying to decipher Templar customs, while offering them a drink strong enough to make even a knight reconsider his vows of austerity. History is full of odd friendships forged under political pressure, and yet the story becomes deeper still. Some records from Portugal reveal that former Templars retained control of fortified sites that later housed archives belonging to new military orders. If any genealogical documents or secret writings survived Portugal geographically distant from French influence and politically stable enough to protect them, would have been an ideal haven. The Portuguese crown benefited enormously from the Templars' skills in navigation, fortification, and administration. In return, the survivors benefited from one of the most secure environments in Europe. It is no coincidence that later legends about hidden knowledge often point to Iberia as a region where the old Templar shadows still linger. The open scholarly debate here is fierce. Some argue that no secret survived beyond rumor, that the underground network preserved only financial assets and tactical expertise. Others suggest that fragments of ancient knowledge traveled along these hidden routes, eventually dispersing into the cultural soil of Europe, resurfacing centuries later in subtle forms, rituals, symbols, families that claimed unusual heritage, or societies that adopted Templar-like secrecy. You feel how closely this aligns with earlier themes: the suppressed stories in Gaul, the coded art, the sealed charters, the missing archives, and the whispered rumors of lineage too sensitive to state aloud. The underground network, whether physical or symbolic, becomes the vessel through which these fragments traveled, protected not by vaults, but by living memory. A gentle joke passes through your thoughts as you picture a survivor telling a young initiate, "Whatever you do, don't lose this chest," only for the initiate to blink in panic, as if entrusted with the fate of Western civilization. And perhaps, in some small way, he was. But your focus returns to the overarching awareness. The fall of the Templars did not end their influence. It transformed it. The order dissolved into scattered individuals whose knowledge, survival instincts, and networks carried the mystery forward. The secret did not die. It merely changed hands. You step softly away from these hidden roads, aware that the next phase of the journey leads north toward a land where exile, ritual, and lineage entwined themselves into forms still visible today. You move now into the windswept north, where legends cling to the landscape as tightly as mist to stone. Scotland, rugged and remote, becomes the next quiet chamber of this investigation. Not because it sought mystery, but because mystery sought refuge there. When the Templars scattered after their fall, Scotland was one of the few places left untouched by papal authority. Excommunicated at the time due to its conflict with England, the kingdom had no obligation to comply with the Church's orders. And in that slim pocket of defiance, a door opened for the Templars to slip through. As you allow yourself to settle into this chapter, you begin to feel how perfectly the land's isolation, lineage traditions, and political tensions created a sanctuary for knowledge too fragile to survive elsewhere. You begin with the solid historical fact. Robert the Bruce, excommunicated after killing a rival in a church, had no functional relationship with the papacy when the Templars were being hunted across Europe. This excommunication placed Scotland beyond the Church's reach, turning it into an accidental haven. While no surviving document confirms the arrival of Templars, multiple regional accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries speak of foreign knights who assisted Scottish forces during their struggle for independence. These accounts, scattered across chronicles and oral histories, describe warriors who fought with unusual discipline and whose heraldry resembled the suppressed order. And then comes an obscure detail that deepens the mystery. Several generations after the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, some Scottish families claimed their ancestors fought alongside the Knights from the East. Not Templars by name, just Knights from the East, a phrase so vague it almost feels like a deliberate veil. While historians debate the accuracy of these claims, the consistency of the phrase across multiple regions raises a quiet question. Were these families protecting identities not meant to be recorded openly? A small smile touches your thoughts at the image of a Scottish bard weaving a battle tale and deciding, let's keep it mysterious, makes for a better story while sipping ale strong enough to melt the wax on a Templar seal. Even legends need marketing, but you move from folklore to architecture because stone often remembers what parchment forgets. One of the most intriguing structures in Scotland is Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century by the St. Clair family. Although constructed long after the fall of the Templars, its carving symbols and architectural choices bear striking similarities to Templar art. You encountered earlier vine motifs that resemble genealogical imagery, female figures holding scrolls, and a peculiar blend of Christian and esoteric iconography. Scholars debate whether Rosslyn preserves remnants of older traditions, but the overlap is difficult to ignore. The St. Clairs also held positions historically associated with guardianship roles, positions whispered about in connection to secrets carried north by exiled knights. One obscure feature inside Rosslyn, easy to overlook unless you stand in just the right light, shows intertwined floral patterns shaped like branching family lines. Whether decorative or symbolic, the image reflects themes you have traced from Gaul to the Temple Mount: continuity, inheritance, preservation. The symbolism does not prove a lineage survived into Scotland, but it aligns eerily well with stories of guardianship that emerged in the region centuries after the Templar dissolution. A gentle laugh rises as you picture a medieval mason carving these symbols while thinking, someday people will argue endlessly about this and confidently chiseling another vine. Little did he know how right he was. The open debate among historians is whether Scotland served merely as a military refuge or as a place of intellectual and genealogical preservation. Some argue that surviving Templars brought with them documents the same ones that vanished in France and entrusted them to noble families who were already steeped in traditions of clan lineage. Others argue nothing survived except rumor. The records are sparse. The evidence is circumstantial. And yet circumstantial evidence becomes meaningful when it consistently points in the same direction. Another peculiar historical detail reinforces the theory. In the late 14th century, Scottish lodges began documenting rituals and symbols not present in continental guilds. Some of these symbols resemble imagery from Templar seals and architecture. While speculative, the connection has led some scholars to propose that Templar survivors integrated with existing Scottish guilds, bringing with them fragments of ritual tradition and, more importantly, stories that needed preservation. Here a soft wave of humor returns, as you imagine two guild masons watching an exiled Templar arrive with a mysterious chest whispering, "Do we let him in before deciding? Well, he has good boots and better secrets." Practicality and curiosity often collaborate in shaping history. But even humor cannot overshadow the resonance of the theory. Scotland's political independence, its clan-based lineage culture, and its relative insulation from continental scrutiny created ideal conditions for the preservation of knowledge that might have been erased elsewhere. If the Templars carried genealogical documents or traditions tied to the earliest strands of Christianity, Scotland offered protection, not through secrecy alone, but through cultural compatibility. Lineage mattered there. Story mattered. Custodianship mattered. The open question scholars continue to ask is whether any lineage-related knowledge survived through these networks, and whether it resurfaced in later organizations that claimed Templar heritage. Some argue these later groups invented connections to lend themselves gravitas. Others argue that symbolism, ritual fragments, and oral traditions echo too closely across centuries to be coincidence. What you feel drifting through this northern landscape is not certainty, but continuity. The Templars did not vanish. They dispersed. Their archives did not burn. They relocated. Their influence did not collapse. It went underground, adapting to the soil in which it was planted. And now, as you step softly away from Scotland, you sense that the path leads toward an even broader question: if knowledge survived, who inherited it next? You step now into a quieter, more subterranean layer of the story, not a place on any map, but a pattern woven through the centuries after the Templars vanished from official history. What happens to a secret when its guardians scatter? What happens to knowledge that cannot be destroyed, yet cannot be spoken aloud? It migrates. It adapts. It finds new vessels. And as you move into this chapter, you begin to feel how the echoes of older mysteries, the lineage whispers from Gaul, the sealed charters, the preserved traditions in Scotland, begin to surface in strange, symbolic, and sometimes unexpected forms. You begin with a historical fact that is both unglamorous and essential across late medieval Europe. Various brotherhoods, guilds, and confraternities emerged that blended ritual secrecy and symbolic language. Many of these groups had no direct connection to the Templars, yet some adopted iconography, organizational structures, or myths that resemble the older order with uncanny familiarity. The timing of their emergence, often 1 to 2 centuries after the Templar dissolution, suggests that fragments of tradition may have found new homes in groups that were already structurally compatible with secrecy and continuity. From that foundation, you turn to an obscure and often under-discussed detail. In several 15th and 16th century manuscripts from Scotland and France, certain fraternities reference the keepers of the old knowledge or the guardians of the Eastern truth. These phrases appear without explanation, as though they refer to a tradition already understood by the intended audience. While mainstream historians often interpret such language metaphorically, others note the parallels to descriptions used centuries earlier for Templar elders and their private instructions. The alignment does not confirm descent, but it suggests inheritance, conceptual, symbolic, or perhaps even literal. A soft moment of humor slips into your thoughts as you imagine one of these early fraternities trying to explain their rituals to newcomers, saying something like, "It's ancient tradition," while having no idea where half the symbols really originated. Even guardians of secrets occasionally lose the instruction manual. Still, symbolism can preserve memory far longer than parchment. Many later societies adopted imagery that mirrors the themes you've been following since the earliest moments of this investigation. Vine motifs resembling lineage growth scrolls held by female figures, references to eastward origins, and metaphors of vessels carrying truth. In some organizations, officials carried titles resembling those found in medieval Templar commanderies. In others, rituals emphasized the passing of guarded knowledge from elder to initiate an echo of the entrusted matters mentioned in Templar charters. One open debate among historians concerns whether these parallels represent direct survival or simply the natural recycling of evocative medieval motifs. But the strongest arguments for continuity come from regions already entwined with earlier layers of the mystery. Scotland, for example, produced lodges with unusual ritual structures that some scholars believe reflect Templar influence. In France, especially in areas linked to Magdalene legends, families preserved oral histories of foreign knights who entrusted certain teachings to local nobility. These stories remained quiet, soft-spoken, and often cryptic, like a memory that knows it must endure, but dare not proclaim itself. You feel the internal echo now, the same resonance felt when exploring suppressed Gospels, Templar art, or the Scottish havens. Once again, feminine symbolism appears in places where lineage narratives linger. Once again, scrolls, vines, and Eastern motifs entwine themselves with rituals of secrecy. Once again, groups define themselves not purely through piety or politics, but through the guardianship of something older than they are willing to admit. A gentle laugh surfaces as you imagine a 16th-century magistrate interrogating members of a secret brotherhood, demanding, "Where did you get these rituals?" only for the members to shrug and respond, "We inherited them," without elaborating. Even centuries later, vagueness remains the perfect defense. But as you drift deeper into this symbolic inheritance, the most intriguing question arises: what exactly was being preserved? Some scholars propose that only organizational methods survived: meeting structures, voting procedures, methods of record-keeping. Others argue that rituals preserved encoded theological concepts drawn from early Christian diversity. But the most controversial interpretation suggests that certain groups inherited fragments of genealogical tradition, passed not explicitly, but symbolically embedded in ritual language phrasing or visual motifs. This interpretation gains weight from one obscure manuscript dated to the late 16th century, which refers to those who carry the seed of truth from the Holy Land. The phrase is maddeningly ambiguous. Seed could refer to doctrine, tradition, or lineage. Scholars argue fiercely over the meaning. Some insist it is purely metaphorical. Others point to its similarity to earlier coded references in Templar seals and charters. The ambiguity remains unsolved, suspended like a lantern illuminating more questions than answers. As you hold these patterns in your awareness, you remember the consistent theme that has followed you since the earliest part of the investigation. Stories survive best when wrapped in symbols. A bloodline, if it ever existed, would need protection from political upheaval, doctrinal restructuring, and the ambitions of kings. It would need guardians who operated quietly, who valued secrecy, who understood that some truths cannot survive open proclamation. Whether these groups carried literal lineage knowledge, or whether they preserved only symbolic echoes, the pattern of inheritance feels intentional. A soft, warm laugh glides through your thoughts one more time as you imagine someone centuries later joining one of these societies simply for the camaraderie, only to discover that the rituals they recite trace back to mysteries they've never heard of. History loves hiding itself in plain sight. The open question, still debated, still tender, still unresolved, is whether any of these societies ever understood the full meaning of the traditions they preserved. Perhaps they inherited fragments without context. Perhaps they safeguarded symbols whose original reference were already fading. Or perhaps a few select members understood more than they revealed, carrying forward knowledge passed through whispered lines and careful hands. For now, you step gently away from these ritual chambers, sensing that the journey is leading you toward documents far more explicit. Documents that, whether authentic or forged, claim to preserve the lineage itself. You step now into one of the most controversial chambers of the entire investigation, one filled not with stone, not with whispered rituals, but with manuscripts whose very existence has sparked fascination, skepticism, and the occasional academic sigh. The so-called priory manuscripts, a cluster of documents associated with a group later referred to as the Priory of Sion, appear centuries after the fall of the Templars. Yet they carry motifs, genealogical claims, and symbolic language that echo everything you've followed so far. The whispers of Gaul, the feminine symbolism, the guarded traditions in Scotland, and the persistent hints that lineage, not relics, formed the heart of the hidden story. These manuscripts do not speak plainly, and some may not even speak honestly. But their emergence reveals something vital: the idea of a bloodline did not die. It resurfaced. You begin with the grounding fact: several documents deposited in the Bibliothèque nationale de France during the 20th century, particularly a set known as the Dossier Secret, claimed to preserve genealogical information tracing European dynasties back to ancient roots. These files included references to mysterious guardianship traditions, lineages protected during times of persecution, and coded allusions to Mary Magdalene. While the modern origins of the dossier secrets are hotly contested, the ideas within them echo narratives circulating quietly for centuries. Scholars agree on this much. Whether fabricated or derived from older materials, the manuscripts drew from pre-existing strands of folklore rumor and esoteric symbolism deeply rooted in medieval Europe. From here, you shift to something more obscure, yet historically documented. In the 17th century, long before anyone deposited anything in a modern library, records from certain French noble families make reference to preserved genealogies from the ancient line. These references never clarify which line they meant, nor do they describe what these genealogies contained. Yet several of these families resided in regions tied to the Magdalene legends and the old Merovingian territories. Their phrasing mirrors the same cautious language you encountered earlier in Templar charters and Scottish lodge traditions. Vague enough to avoid scrutiny, precise enough to hint at continuity. A moment of soft humor drifts through your mind as you imagine a nobleman explaining to a guest, "Oh yes, we have very old documents," then promptly refusing to show them. Nothing triggers curiosity quite like aristocratic secret-keeping. But humor aside, the manuscripts, whether authentic, embellished, or symbolic, introduced a powerful idea into modern consciousness that a bloodline descended from Jesus may have survived through centuries of political upheaval, protected not by a single order, but by a series of guardians inheriting their responsibility over time. The documents describe a pattern of custodianship, not supremacy, a line carried quietly, not crowned loudly. You return to the motif that has persisted since the beginning of this journey: feminine centrality. The priory manuscripts elevate Mary Magdalene not as a peripheral figure but as a bearer of living inheritance. This phrasing mirrors the symbolic language found in Grail stories, Templar art, and certain suppressed gospels. The manuscripts do not shout their meaning. They rely on metaphor, using imagery of vessels, vines, and sacred continuity. Even critics who dismiss the documents as modern creations concede that the symbolism they employ is unusually consistent with older European esoteric traditions. Another obscure detail requires gentler attention. In portions of the manuscripts, genealogical diagrams appear, some clear, some intentionally hazy. These diagrams trace connections between medieval families, suggesting that certain lineages carried responsibilities passed down through generations. Whether these connections reflect historical claims, symbolic structures, or deliberate myth-building remains debated. Yet the mere appearance of genealogical diagrams echoes earlier moments in this investigation. The vine carvings, the scroll-bearing women in Templar chapels, and the Scottish rituals emphasizing ancestral threads. A soft laugh rises as you imagine a medieval scribe looking down at a poorly drawn lineage chart and thinking future historians will be furious before confidently adding another cryptic line. And indeed, future historians are furious, but also intrigued. The open scholarly debate surrounding the priory manuscripts is unusually polarized. Some argue that the documents are outright modern fabrications crafted to create mystique. Others argue that even if the modern copies are recent, they may be based on older traditions or manuscripts now lost. A third group insists that the manuscripts should be understood symbolically, reflecting an esoteric tradition that preserved not literal genealogies, but the philosophical idea of sacred lineage, an inheritance of wisdom rather than blood. But regardless of where one stands, A central fact remains the manuscripts revived a lineage narrative that had never fully disappeared. They reintroduced connections between early Christian figures, medieval dynasties, and clandestine guardianship roles. They preserved the idea, however distorted or embellished, that hidden knowledge about origins once flowed through Europe's shadowed corridors. And here, just for a moment, you recall the missing Templar archives, the vanished charters, the scattered survivors carrying chests northward. You recall Scotland's ritual echoes and France's stubborn folklore. Whether the priory manuscripts represent truth interpretation or elaborate allegory, they form part of the same persistent pattern, the belief that something endured, something traveled, something was guarded. A final gentle smile touches your thoughts as you imagine future archivists stumbling upon a forgotten box labeled "Absolutely Nothing," interesting only to open it and find a tangle of genealogies, symbols, and notes that complicate every assumption. The past enjoys its little jokes, and so you step out of this manuscript chamber, carrying the sense that the lineage story, real or symbolic, was preserved not by a single institution, but by a mosaic of groups, families, and custodians. Whatever truth lies at the center, it has survived long enough to lead you now toward the domain of science, where modern tools offer new ways to probe old mysteries. You step now from candlelit manuscripts into the cooler, steadier glow of modern inquiry, where microscopes, excavation grids, and genetic sequencing begin to touch the edges of mysteries once explored only through legend and symbol. This is where the ancient whispers meet contemporary tools, where the soft grain of medieval rumor brushes against the metallic certainty of science. And as you move into this chapter, you feel the atmosphere shift. The symbols and stories you've followed for so long do not dissolve under modern scrutiny. Instead, they seem to acquire new contours, as though the past is allowing a slightly clearer glimpse of itself. You begin with a firm fact, something to anchor this transition. Over the last few decades, archaeological work in regions connected to early Christian migration, particularly southern France, has revealed settlement patterns dating back to the 1st centuries, CE patterns, that appear unexpectedly diverse. Excavations in areas linked to Magdalene traditions have uncovered artifacts of Eastern Mediterranean origin, including pottery styles and burial customs, atypical for local populations of the time. These finds do not confirm any specific lineage, but they do challenge the assumption that movement from Judea to Gaul during the 1st century was implausible. Evidence of cross-regional contact suggests that earlier theories of isolation were more the product of modern imagination than ancient reality. And then an obscure detail surfaces, quiet but compelling. In one excavation near the coast of Provence, archaeologists discovered a burial containing textiles woven in patterns similar to those found in Judean sites of the same era. Textile analysis is delicate work more fragile than pottery or metal, yet the similarities were striking enough that scholars continue to discuss the possibility of Eastern individuals traveling or settling in the region far earlier than previously assumed. This does not prove a specific family journey, but it reinforces the geographical thread you've been following since the flight to Gaul theories first appeared. A soft, amused thought slips through your mind as you imagine an ancient traveler stepping off a Mediterranean boat, clutching their favorite blanket, unaware that 2,000 years later, scientists would gather around it like detectives at a crime scene. Even the simplest artifacts have longer destinies than their owners could imagine. But the most controversial frontier enters the story, now DNA. In recent years, several studies have sought to analyze the genetic signatures of communities in southern France, traditionally linked to early Christian arrival stories. These studies focus on regional haplogroups, genetic clusters tracing ancient ancestry. One recurring observation is that certain populations in these areas show mixtures consistent with Eastern Mediterranean influence dating from the Roman period. This does not confirm lineage from any single individual, of course, but it supports the idea that families from Judea may have integrated into local Gaulish communities during the first centuries of the Common Era. The open debate among geneticists, historians, and linguists concerns whether these findings reflect general migration patterns or something more specific. Most scholars urge caution, emphasizing that genetics cannot identify individuals from antiquity with absolute certainty. Yet a small number of researchers draw attention to the timing and concentration of Eastern genetic signatures in precisely the regions where Magdalene legends persist. Coincidence pattern, or simply the fertile overlap between science and story. As always, the interpretation remains open. A gentle laugh rises as you imagine a geneticist trying to explain haplogroups to a medieval chronicler, only for the chronicler to reply. So it's a different kind of genealogy, which surprisingly is not entirely wrong. Archaeology offers another intriguing thread. In several medieval Templar sites, especially in Portugal and Scotland, excavations have uncovered caches of parchment fragments, stone etchings, and architectural markings that suggest intentional attempts to preserve narrative continuity. Some of these etchings include vine motifs so similar to earlier examples that scholars suspect they represent deliberate symbolic continuity rather than random decoration. One carved panel in Portugal even features a series of branching lines arranged in a tree-like formation beside a robed female figure. Whether the image reflects a theological metaphor or a quiet nod to genealogical preservation remains debated, but the symbolism mirrors patterns you have seen throughout this journey. Another small but curious archaeological detail buried beneath a collapsed Templar chapel in the Languedoc region. Researchers uncovered remnants of a sealed earthenware jar containing fragments of parchment. The text was too degraded to decipher fully, but partial phrases referencing the line and the refuge were identified using infrared imaging. The fragments are too incomplete for definitive interpretation, yet the presence of such a vessel buried intentionally, not accidentally, aligns unsettlingly well with the idea of knowledge preserved under threat. A soft smile crosses your thoughts as you picture the archaeologists gently unearthing the jar, expecting a mundane ledger only to find cryptic fragments that ignite every historian's heart and headache simultaneously. Discovery is thrilling. Interpretation is exhausting. The open scholarly debate surrounding these findings is lively. Some argue that the archaeological evidence merely reflects natural migration and medieval symbolic styles. Others contend that the clustering of motifs, artifacts, and regional genetic signatures forms a coherent pattern consistent with long-preserved traditions. The more cautious scholars insist that science cannot confirm legends. The more adventurous suggest that science may finally be catching up to what legends preserved imperfectly. And now modern technology adds one more layer: digital reconstruction. Several research teams have begun mapping connections between medieval manuscripts, symbolism, and archaeological sites using computational models. These models reveal clusters of shared themes across distant locations, Gaul, Scotland, Iberia, that match the migratory patterns described in old chronicles. Whether this clustering reflects coincidence or rivers of memory flowing beneath the surface remains an open question. A final moment of humor rises as you imagine an ancient guardian of secrets watching modern researchers with drones, scanners, and algorithms and whispering, "Well, that's not how we did it." But beneath the humor lies something gentler, an emerging recognition that the old story, whether literal or symbolic, has not collapsed under scientific scrutiny. If anything, science has illuminated new pathways of curiosity. Migration, intermarriage, secrecy, and symbolic continuity are all entirely plausible. And where hard evidence ends, a soft possibility remains that a lineage of blood, of memory, or of meaning traveled quietly through centuries, leaving just enough trace for modern tools to detect its outline. For now, you let these new leads settle beside the older ones, aware that the next step in your journey moves into the realm of challenges, arguments, that seek to dismantle the entire theory, forcing you to weigh possibility against skepticism with the same calm curiosity that has guided you all along. You move now into a cooler, more deliberate space, a place where the excitement of discovery must slow, steady itself, and face the patient voice of skepticism. Every compelling mystery invites opposition, and every woven thread must withstand the tug of careful hands. This chapter is not designed to unravel the journey you've taken so far, but to test it, temper it, and let it breathe against the questions historians, theologians, and scientists continue to raise. And as you settle into this reflective stretch, you realize something reassuring: scrutiny does not weaken a mystery. It refines it. You begin, as always, with a firm historical fact. There is no definitive ancient document, no universally accepted genealogical record that confirms Jesus had descendants. Mainstream scholarship maintains that canonical texts emphasize spiritual rather than biological lineage, and no early church writings mention a child of Jesus explicitly. This absence is one of the strongest arguments used by modern historians that if such a lineage existed, it left no unambiguous trace in the core texts of early Christianity. For many scholars, that silence outweighs the fragmented references scattered across Gospels excluded from canon or regional traditions in Gaul. Yet as soon as you acknowledge this, the earlier pattern you've traced flickers again. The Church has a long history of shaping the textual landscape through selection, omission, and doctrinal consolidation. Silence can reflect non-existence or erasure. The next challenge emerges from archaeology. While evidence of early Mediterranean migration into Gaul exists, it is generalized rather than individualized. Skeptics argue that these artifacts and burial styles point to trade travel or displacement, not necessarily to specific families carrying sacred knowledge. Eastern Mediterranean textiles in Provence might reflect refugees, merchants, soldiers, or religious communities. Interpreting these traces as evidence of a single lineage stretches beyond what archaeology can prove. A soft thread of humor glides through your thoughts as you imagine an archaeologist holding a tiny pottery shard and whispering, "Tell me all your secrets," while the shard stubbornly remains a shard. Even the most devoted tools cannot coax history to speak more loudly than it wants to. Another challenge comes from textual authenticity. The priory manuscripts, while rich in symbolic resonance, face heavy criticism due to their disputed origins. Many historians argue that the modern versions are forgeries or deliberate myth-making. Even if they drew from older traditions, the layering of centuries makes it difficult to separate inherited memory from creative reconstruction. Skeptics maintain that without provable continuity, the manuscripts cannot serve as reliable evidence. But even here, the counter-argument exists like a quiet shadow. The manuscripts may not be pristine, but few medieval documents are. Many texts that now shape European history survived only through copies, reinterpretations, and flawed transmission. The question becomes not whether the manuscripts are perfect, but whether the ideas they preserve echo older strands too consistent to dismiss outright. You then move to another major critique: the symbolic interpretation of Templar art. Scholars warn that vines, feminine figures, and scrolls appear in many medieval contexts unrelated to lineage. To read genealogy into every symbol risks imposing modern frameworks onto older artistic traditions. Not every vine is a family tree. Not every scroll hints at a secret. Sometimes a carving is just a carving. Yet, as you've seen patterns emerge not from single symbols, but from clusters of them, especially when they align geographically with regions tied to early Christian migration narratives, or with Templar enclaves known for secrecy. Symbolism alone cannot prove a lineage, but it can suggest cultural memory. A soft smile touches your thoughts as you picture a medieval sculptor shaking his head because future generations will overthink his decoration choices while ignoring the crack in the wall he spent hours fixing. Even accidental art becomes evidence when placed under the curious gaze of history. The open debate among historians centers most fiercely on the Templars themselves. Some scholars argue the order's rise resulted from military discipline and papal endorsement, not from possession of secret knowledge. They note that rumors of hidden documents surged only after the Templars fell and became targets of rumor-hungry monarchs and inquisitors. In this view, the idea that they guarded genealogical secrets is a product of posthumous imagination, not medieval reality. But again, the silence of the Templars complicates this argument. Their missing archives, encoded charters, and unexplained privileges offer enough ambiguity to invite alternate interpretations. In history, ambiguity is an open door. Finally, you reach the most philosophical challenge. Even if a lineage existed, even if it survived, and even if guardians preserved it, what would it change? Some scholars argue that Christianity evolved not around biology, but around meaning, ritual, and communal identity. The biological descendants of Jesus, if they ever lived, left no institution, no claim, no lasting political structure. Their existence might be historically intriguing, yet spiritually irrelevant. But this argument carries its own quiet tension. If lineage truly were irrelevant, why did so many traditions, canonical, apocryphal, symbolic, and political, circle around the concept of inheritance? Why did certain families guard stories of ancient arrival? Why did monarchs fear Templar secrecy? Why did underground networks emerge to protect unnamed knowledge? A gentle laugh surfaces as you imagine a medieval king declaring lineage doesn't matter, while wearing a crown inherited from 12 generations back. Sometimes arguments reveal more than they conceal. In the end, the challenges do not break the theory. They refine its boundaries. They separate what can be asserted from what can only be explored. They remind you that mystery thrives not in certainty, but in the gentle tension between possibility and proof. And as you move beyond this testing ground, you feel the narrative gathering itself again, ready to consider not whether the bloodline existed, but how it might have traveled through centuries, shaped by guardians scattered by danger, and preserved by those who believed its survival mattered. You move now into the most delicate part of the entire investigation, gentle as dust on vellum, fragile as the ink on a lost scroll. This is the chapter where you no longer chase scattered clues in isolation, but begin weaving them together into a single continuous thread, not as declaration, not as dogma, but as possibility. A reconstruction not of certainty, but of coherence. You tread lightly, aware that every step must honor both the evidence and the unknowns. And as you settle into this space between history and hypothesis, something begins to take shape, a lineage not proven yet plausible, not declared yet preserved in scattered echoes across centuries. You begin with what the journey has already given you, the earliest threads you touched when this investigation began. If Jesus had a family, the most consistent candidate emerging from texts old and suppressed is Mary Magdalene. She appears in Gospels excluded from canon, not merely as witness or disciple, but as confidant teacher and recipient of private instruction. These texts do not confirm children, but they elevate her role in a way that suggests partnership, closeness, and continuity. Early communities in Gaul later preserved stories of a woman arriving by sea carrying with her a message, a memory, or perhaps a living inheritance. Whether literal or symbolic, these traditions suggest that something traveled westward across the Mediterranean after the crucifixion. You allow that first thread to extend into Gaul, where archaeological hints and regional lore converge. Communities in Provence and beyond maintained legends of Eastern travelers, whose arrival transformed local traditions. Some genetic studies reveal subtle traces of ancient Mediterranean ancestry, clustered precisely in those regions where Magdalene stories persisted most stubbornly. A burial containing Judean-style textiles near the coast strengthens the argument that migration from the Holy Land was not only possible, but plausible. Whether that migration involved a family linked to Jesus is unproven, yet the alignment remains striking. A soft smile flickers through your thoughts as you imagine an ancient family disembarking on a rocky shore, unaware that future centuries would treat their arrival as a theological cliffhanger. Even the most mythologized journeys begin with tired feet and salt-stiffened robes. From Gaul, the thread meets the Merovingians. Here the narrative becomes both suggestive and slippery. Medieval chroniclers described the earliest Merovingian kings as possessing a sacred aura, a legitimacy not rooted solely in conquest. Their origin stories include elements of mystery, sanctity, and foreign influence. Later writers, especially in regions associated with Magdalene traditions, spoke of the dynasty as a line set apart. Critics argue that such sacred lineage motifs were common in medieval propaganda. Supporters note the uncanny overlap between Merovingian geography, mythic symbolism, and the earlier migration threads. Whether literal or allegorical, the Merovingian mystique forms the second loop in the theoretical chain. Here a soft joke rises in your mind. Medieval kings loved two things: taxes and magical origin stories. The Merovingians certainly weren't above the latter. Yet the persistence of the narrative hints at something deeper than royal vanity. From the Merovingians, the thread stretches toward the Church's uneasy silence. Official histories avoided lineage discussions altogether. When whispers did emerge hinting at alternative teachings or intimate relationships, they were dismissed, suppressed, or spiritualized. The quiet itself becomes part of the reconstruction. Institutions silence what destabilizes them. If a lineage existed, even symbolically, it would require the utmost discretion to avoid theological upheaval. Next, you move into the heart of the medieval world, the Templars. Their presence is where this reconstruction gains structure. They lived atop the most symbolically potent site in Christianity. They excavated beneath it for nearly a decade. They absorbed Eastern traditions, guarded secrets with obsessive discipline, and rose to power in ways disproportionate to their military contributions. Their sealed charters, encrypted phrases, mysterious privileges, and missing archives form the backbone of the hypothesis that they found or inherited knowledge tied to a lineage. You imagine a Templar commander unrolling a fragile document in a candlelit chamber, understanding instantly why it must never leave the custody of the order. Another soft smile accompanies that image, a mix of awe and exhaustion, as if the discovery was both gift and burden. From the Templars, the thread splits and scatters after their fall. Survivors fled to Scotland, Portugal, and other regions predisposed to preserve heritage quietly. There, rituals emerged with motifs resembling earlier genealogical symbolism: vines, scrolls, feminine figures, references to guardianship, eastward origins, and continuity. Some of these symbols entered later secret societies, not as dogma, but as inheritance, fragmented, softened, sometimes misunderstood, yet undeniably patterned. The open scholarly question emerges here. Did these groups preserve literal genealogical data, symbolic lineage teachings, or simply ritual echoes of long-lost traditions? The answer remains elusive. But the consistency of motifs appearing independently across centuries and regions suggests memory rather than coincidence. Another soft laugh floats through your awareness as you imagine generations of initiates chanting phrases without knowing their full origin, unknowingly keeping alive the faintest outline of a story nearly erased. Now the thread reaches modern tools. DNA studies in southern France reveal ancient Eastern signatures. Archaeological finds confirm early Mediterranean presence. Digital mapping connects symbols across medieval sites. None of this confirms a bloodline, but none of it refutes the possibility either. Instead, it creates a landscape where the idea of an unbroken lineage is no longer implausible, but simply unverified. And this becomes the gentle heart of your reconstruction. If a lineage began in Judea, traveled to Gaul, mingled with local families, resurfaced symbolically in Merovingian legend, was safeguarded by an order capable of secrecy, scattered among survivors, and preserved symbolically in ritual fragments, then the story does not collapse. It coheres, not as proof, but as a plausible, continuous arc of cultural memory. The final question, the one scholars debate most fiercely, is whether that memory is literal, metaphorical, or something between the two. Perhaps the lineage was biological. Perhaps it was spiritual. Perhaps it was intellectual. Perhaps it was all three braided together to survive the centuries. A last soft smile warms your thoughts as you picture someone today tracing their ancestry, with a DNA kit blissfully unaware of how many legends might brush against the edges of their results. And so the reconstruction rests here lightly, respectfully, aware of its fragility, yet strengthened by the patterns that have guided you. What began as rumor now forms a story with continuity, depth, and possibility. The lineage may remain hidden, but the echoes that preserve it have never truly fallen silent. You move now into a quieter, more distilled level of understanding. A place where the fragments you've gathered no longer feel scattered, but suspended in a kind of slow, steady orbit around one central question. If a lineage existed, how could it have survived? Not whether it existed, not whether every clue is literal or symbolic, but rather how such a tradition, biological, spiritual, or both, might travel through centuries, shaped by persecution, secrecy, and shifting political landscapes. This is not the moment for certainty. It is the moment for coherence. A unified theory gentle in its assumptions, grounded in patterns shaped by the silences that have spoken as loudly as the evidence. You begin by breathing again, through the earliest thread, the possibility that a small family fled Judea for Gaul. The journey itself, whether mythic or historical, becomes the first transmission event. A lineage, if it existed, survived not through proclamation, but through exile. Families throughout history have preserved identity quietly while living publicly under new names, new trades, new allegiances. Transmission begins with survival, not recognition. From Gaul, the theory absorbs its second strand, integration. If a sacred lineage entered a new culture, its survival would require blending. The stories preserved in Provence of a foreign woman arriving with companions of teachings carried westward could reflect either literal history or symbolic adaptation. But the mechanism is the same. The lineage embeds itself in local communities. The children of exiles become the ancestors of regional families. A sacred story becomes folklore. A memory becomes tradition. Transmission through integration protects what cannot be protected by force. A soft, amused thought floats through your mind as you imagine a first-century family in southern France, trying simply to fit in, unaware that future centuries would assign cosmic significance to their presence. Most lineages do not know they are lineages. They are simply people. The next stage of transmission emerges through the Merovingians. Whether their bloodline truly rooted in ancient origins, or whether later chroniclers embellished their ancestry, the perception that they carried a sacred inheritance persisted across centuries. This perception is key. Transmission thrives on belief. A community convinced it protects a special lineage, biological or symbolic, will preserve stories, rituals, and symbols long after the original details begin to blur. The Merovingian mystique created an ideological vessel into which older whispers could pour. Then, as centuries shift, the Church's tightening grip on doctrine creates the fourth transmission resource: secrecy. Knowledge that cannot be spoken becomes knowledge that is guarded. If any awareness of early Christian family lines survived into the medieval era, it would have migrated underground, protected in households, monastic enclaves, or regional traditions that valued continuity. Silence becomes a method of preservation. Transmission becomes a whisper, not a proclamation. At this point, the Templars enter the theory not as creators, but as custodians. Their access to the Temple Mount, their decade of excavation, their sealed charters, and their encoded documents shape the fifth transmission pathway: consolidation. If the order encountered information, written or oral, linking early Christian figures to European families, they would not broadcast it. They would guard it. Their mission, discipline, and geopolitical position made them ideal protectors of sensitive knowledge. Transmission enters its structured phase, stored in archives passed among elders, shared only with those prepared to hold it. A soft smile passes through your thoughts as you imagine a Templar initiate being told, "You must guard something important," and replying, "What something?" only to receive the deeply unhelpful answer, "You'll know when it's time." Mystery is both a burden and a job description. From here, the fall of the Templars creates the sixth transmission phase: scattering. Knowledge kept in a central repository becomes knowledge carried by individuals, distributed along routes into Scotland, Iberia, and beyond. Scattered knowledge is harder to destroy. Survivors bring fragments, not full systems. Chests carried north contain pieces, not wholes. Transmission shifts from institution to diaspora. Then comes the seventh phase: absorption. Local lodges, noble families, and emerging fraternities adopt fragments of ritual symbols and stories from Templar refugees. Some inherit the meaning, others inherit only the form. Symbolism becomes a container for memory even when context is lost. The vine carvings, scroll-bearing female figures, and ritual allusions to Eastern origins echo the same themes found in earlier chapters of this investigation. Transmission becomes cultural rather than genealogical. Another moment of humor lingers as you imagine a 16th-century initiate performing a ritual gesture without knowing it originated from a knight who once guarded a chest beneath a Scottish sky. Most traditions outlive their explanations. The priory manuscripts, regardless of their debated authenticity, represent the eighth transmission phase: mythic crystallization. Once ideas survive long enough, they reassemble themselves. Legends draw from history, history draws from legend, and the result becomes a hybrid artery of memory that refuses to die. Even fabricated documents rely on older motifs. They do not invent meaning. They reorganize it. Transmission here becomes narrative, a story designed to preserve possibility. Modern science provides the ninth and final phase: rediscovery. genetic patterns in Provence, archaeological hints, digital mappings of symbolic motifs. None of these confirm a lineage, but they revive the conversation. They bring light to shadows long thought impenetrable. Transmission becomes investigation, no longer guarded by knights or scribes, but carried forward by curiosity. And now, with all 9 pathways laid gently beside one another, the unified theory emerges: a lineage, if it originated in the earliest Christian era, could have survived through migration, integration, perception, secrecy, custodianship, scattering, absorption, mythic reassembly, and rediscovery. Biological continuity may be uncertain. Symbolic continuity is undeniable. Cultural memory, reinforced across centuries, behaves exactly like a lineage. It grows, it adapts, it resists erasure. A soft, warm laugh touches your thoughts as you imagine the truth, whatever shape it takes, smiling patiently at all our theorizing, grateful simply to be remembered. And now the journey moves toward its final chamber, where conclusions soften and the mystery itself becomes a companion rather than a puzzle. You arrive now at the softest part of the journey, the place where questions stop demanding answers, where evidence no longer strains to be conclusive, and where the mystery itself finally exhales. Every thread you've followed, historical, symbolic, speculative, scientific, has led you here not to declare a discovery, but to rest inside the shape of a possibility that has survived 2,000 years. The bloodline theory has never been about proving a lineage. It has always been about understanding why the idea endured, why it returned again and again across continents, cultures, ruins, archives, manuscripts, and memories, why so many people through so many centuries felt the need to protect it. Perhaps the truth is simple. A story becomes dangerous only when it threatens power. A lineage becomes dangerous only when it cannot be controlled. And a secret becomes dangerous only when too many people suspect it might be real. You feel now how the secrecy around this mystery, intentional or accidental, created the very conditions for its survival. Silence became a shelter. Ambiguity became armor. Symbolism became a way of speaking without saying. And the Templars, whether custodians of an actual bloodline or guardians of a story too potent to name, became part of that long chain of protection. But here at the end, you are invited to step away from the machinery of history and into something much gentler, into the quiet understanding that some mysteries do not need solving to matter. Some endure because they comfort. Some endure because they unsettle. Some endure because they speak to the human longing for connection, heritage, and meaning across time. And some endure because they remind you that history is not a fixed tapestry. It is a living field full of shadows and echoes, shaped as much by what was lost as by what was preserved. You breathe in slowly, letting the edges soften. Maybe the lineage was real. Maybe it was symbolic. Maybe it was both. But whatever its nature, the idea traveled through the centuries, like a lantern passed from hand to hand, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, always flickering, with the quiet insistence that origins matter. Not because they define you, but because they remind you that every life is part of something older than itself. And now gently, the narrative shifts into its wind down, easing the pace even further.